Hey everyone, welcome to Animind. I hope you're all doing well. Today I want to argue that One Piece is not unwatchable because the story is bad, because the story might genuinely be the greatest adventure ever put to paper. One Piece is unwatchable because Toei Animation took that masterpiece and buried it under over 1,000 episodes of glacial pacing, recycled flashbacks, padded fights, inconsistent animation, and a production model so fundamentally broken that it turns a story you should be sprinting through into something that feels like wading through quicksand. From the 4Kids dub that nearly killed the series in the West before it ever had a chance, to the one chapter per episode policy that drained the life out of every arc after Marineford, to the fake deaths that destroyed any sense of real stakes. One Piece anime has spent 25 years actively working against the incredible story it is supposed to be telling, and today we are going to break down exactly how and why that happened. But before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free, and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough. Let's begin. The 1,155 episode wall. Why nobody wants to start. One Piece is one of the most popular anime ever made. It has broken sales records, inspired millions of fans across the world, and built a universe so deep and detailed that people spend years inside it. And yet, when you ask someone who's never watched it why they have not started, the answer is almost always the same. It is too long. And honestly, it is really hard to argue with that. As of right now, the One Piece anime sits at over 1,155 episodes. That number alone is enough to make most people close the tab and go watch something else. And we are not talking about short little 5-minute episodes either. Each episode of One Piece runs somewhere between 22 and 24 minutes. So if you take the average and multiply it across all those episodes, you are looking at roughly 461 hours of content. To put that in a way that actually makes sense, that is about 19 full days of watching. Not 19 days where you watch a few hours and then go to sleep. 19 days of non-stop, no breaks, no eating, no sleeping, eyes glued to the screen, watching. Obviously, nobody is going to do that, which means in real life, watching One Piece from start to finish is a commitment that stretches across months. And for most people, it stretches across years. Now compare that to what most anime fans are used to. The average seasonal anime runs for about 12 to 25 episodes. A show like Demon Slayer, which is one of the biggest anime in the world right now, has around 55 episodes across its multiple seasons. Attack on Titan, which told a complete story from beginning to end, wrapped everything up in 94 episodes. Jujutsu Kaisen sits at a similar range. These are shows that people can start and finish in a reasonable amount of time, and that matters more than a lot of people realize. When someone finishes work or school and sits down to pick a new anime, they are looking at what they can reasonably get through. And when they see 1,155 episodes next to One Piece on whatever streaming app they are using, most of them just scroll right past it. This is what fans call the barrier to entry, and it is One Piece's single biggest problem when it comes to growing its audience. The show has been airing since October of 1999. That is over 25 years of weekly episodes, and in that time, the episode count has ballooned into something that feels almost impossible to approach as a new viewer. Think about it this way. If you decided today that you were going to start watching One Piece, and you committed to watching 3 episodes every single day without missing a day, it would still take you over a year to catch up. 3 episodes a day, every day, for more than 365 days. And that is assuming you never take a break, never get busy, and never lose interest during one of the slower stretches of the show. For a lot of people, that math just does not work out, and they never even try. And here is the thing that makes this even harder. One Piece is not the kind of show where you can just jump in at any point. You cannot start at episode 500 and figure out what is going on. The story builds on itself constantly. Characters that get introduced in the first 50 episodes become important again hundreds of episodes later. Plot points that seem like throwaway details in the East Blue come back around during arcs that do not start until episode 700 or 800. The whole thing is connected, and that is one of the things fans love most about it. But it also means there are no shortcuts. If you want to experience One Piece, you have to start at episode 1, and you have to go through every single arc in order. Some fans will tell you to just read the manga instead, and there is some truth to that suggestion. The manga is faster to get through because reading is quicker than watching, and the pacing in the manga is much better than the anime. But the manga has over 1,100 chapters of its own, and while each chapter can be read in a few minutes, that still adds up to a massive time investment. On top of that, not everyone wants to read manga. A lot of people got into anime specifically because they prefer watching over reading, and telling those people to just switch to the manga is not really a solution. It is more like admitting that the anime has a problem. Now, some people have tried to create solutions for this problem outside of the official channels. There's a fan-made project called One Piece that takes the anime and re-edits it, cutting out all the padding, the stretched scenes, the repeated flashbacks, and the filler content that slows the show down. One Piece has managed to trim the anime down significantly, and a lot of fans swear by it as the best way to watch the show. But asking a new viewer to go find an unofficial fan project, download edited episodes, and watch a version of the show that is not even on any streaming platform is a big ask. Most people are not going to do that. They are going to open up their streaming app, see 1,155 episodes, and decide it is not worth the effort. Even Toei Animation, the studio that makes the One Piece anime, has shown through their own work that the episode count is inflated way beyond what it needs to be. When they went back and remastered the Fishman Island story arc, which originally ran for 58 episodes in the anime, they managed to cut it down to just 21 episodes. They included every important piece of information, every key story beat, and every moment that mattered. And they did it in roughly a third of the original episode count. That means nearly 40 episodes of that arc were padding, stretched scenes, and content that added nothing to the actual story. If you applied that same ratio across the entire series, you could probably tell the whole One Piece story in somewhere around 400 to 500 episodes, instead of over 1,000. And that number is important because it changes the entire conversation. At 500 episodes, One Piece is still a very long show, but it is in the same range as Naruto or Bleach, and plenty of people have gotten through those. At 500 episodes, the barrier to entry drops dramatically. At 500 episodes, you can tell someone that if they watch 3 episodes a day, they will be caught up in about 6 months instead of over a year. That is a much easier sell. But we do not have a 500 episode version of One Piece. What we have is 1,155 episodes and counting, with new ones still being added every single week. Netflix tried to address this problem in their own way when they released the live-action One Piece adaptation. The first season of the live-action show covered the entire East Blue story arc, which takes 61 episodes in the anime, and they did it in just 8 episodes. 8 episodes. The show was a massive hit, pulling in nearly 72 million views on Netflix during 2023, making it one of their most watched shows that year. And a huge chunk of those viewers were people who had never watched the anime and had no interest in sitting through over 1,000 episodes. The live-action show proved that there is a massive audience out there who wants to experience One Piece, but simply cannot commit to the anime's ridiculous length. What makes all of this even more frustrating is that the people who do push through and watch One Piece almost always end up loving it. The fans are not lying when they say the story is incredible. The world building is some of the best in all of fiction. The characters are deeply written and emotionally complex. The highs of One Piece, the moments that make fans cry and cheer and lose their minds, those moments are real and they are powerful. Nobody is arguing that the story itself is bad. The problem is that the anime has wrapped that incredible story inside a package that is so bloated and so long that most people will never get to experience those highs. And the length problem is not just about scaring away new viewers. It also affects the fans who are already watching. Over the years, a lot of longtime One Piece fans have dropped off during the slower stretches of the anime. When the pacing gets really bad, and it does get really bad in certain arcs, even dedicated fans who have been watching for years start to feel the fatigue. They take breaks, they fall behind, and sometimes they just never come back. Some of them switch to the manga permanently and abandon the anime entirely. Others just step away from One Piece altogether and wait for updates from friends about when the story gets good again. This is one of those rare situations where a show's greatest strength is also its greatest weakness. The fact that One Piece has been running for over 25 years means there's a depth to the world and the characters that very few other stories can match. But it also means the anime has accumulated a mountain of episodes that towers over every potential new fan, and most of them will look at that mountain and decide they would rather watch something else. The manga creator Eiichiro Oda has said that One Piece is now in its final saga, and the story is heading toward its conclusion. But even with that finish line in view, the anime is still pumping out new episodes every week, and the total count is only going to keep climbing. By the time the series actually ends, we could easily be looking at over 1,300 or even 1,400 episodes. And every single episode that gets added makes the wall higher for anyone who has not started yet. So when people say One Piece is unwatchable, this is usually the first thing they are talking about. They are not saying the story is bad. They are not saying the characters are not interesting. They are saying that 1,155 episodes is an absurd amount of content to ask someone to sit through, especially when a large portion of that runtime is padding that does not need to be there. The story could be told in less than half the episodes, and it would probably be better for it. But that is not the show we got. The show we got is a beautiful, incredible story trapped inside an anime that does not respect your time. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And the length is really just the beginning of the problem, because even if someone decides to push through that episode count and give One Piece a chance, the very first thing they are going to run into is a version of the show that was so badly handled, so aggressively censored, and so fundamentally broken that it nearly killed One Piece in the entire Western market before the real show ever had a chance. Section 2. The Four Kids Disaster. How America Almost Killed One Piece. Before we even get into the problems with the actual anime itself, we need to talk about something that happened in the early 2000s that nearly destroyed One Piece in the West world before it ever had a real chance. Because while One Piece was already a massive hit in Japan, selling millions of copies and dominating the ratings, most people in America had no idea it even existed. And when it finally did arrive on American television, it arrived in the worst possible way. In 2004, a company called 4Kids Entertainment picked up the rights to dub One Piece into English and bring it to American audiences. Now, 4Kids was a company that mostly handled shows aimed at young children. They had done dubs for Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! Before, and their whole approach was to take whatever show they were working on and reshape it to fit children's television standards in America. For a show like Pokemon, that approach worked fine. But One Piece is not Pokemon. One Piece is a story about pirates. People get stabbed. People get shot. Characters die. There is blood. There is alcohol. There are cigarettes. There are serious themes about slavery, racism, government corruption, and war. Trying to turn One Piece into a Saturday morning cartoon for little kids was a disaster waiting to happen, and that is exactly what it became. Here is the wild part. 4Kids never even wanted One Piece. According to Mark Kirk, who was a former vice president at 4Kids, the company got One Piece as part of a package deal with Toei Animation. 4Kids wanted to license two other Toei shows, Magical Do-Re-Mi and Ultimate Muscle, and Toei bundled One Piece into the deal because they desperately wanted their biggest property to break into the American market. But 4Kids had never watched a single episode of One Piece before they agreed to the deal. When they finally sat down and looked at what they had just signed up to dub, they were shocked by how much violence the show contained. They did not want to do it. But the deal was already done, and Toei was not going to let them back out of it. So 4Kids did what 4Kids always did. They started cutting, censoring, and changing everything they could to make the show fit their target audience of young children. And the changes they made were so extreme, so ridiculous, and so damaging to the actual story that the 4Kids dub of One Piece is still considered one of the worst anime dubs ever made, more than 20 years later. Let us start with the most obvious change: guns. One Piece is a show about pirates, and pirates use guns. The Marines use guns. Villains use guns. Guns are everywhere in this series from the very first episode. But 4Kids refused to show realistic firearms on screen. So instead of removing the guns from scenes, which would have required cutting half the show, they digitally edited them into other objects. Marine soldiers went from holding rifles to holding what looked like water guns or strange laser-like devices. In one particularly ridiculous edit, a character named Helmeppo holds a real pistol to another character's head in the original version, but in the 4Kids dub, he appears to be threatening him with some kind of weird camera or toy. And when Nami's adopted mother, Belmare, confronts the villain Arlong with a rifle shoved down his throat, the 4Kids version replaced the gun with a shovel. A shovel. The gun censorship also created a major problem right from the very first episode. In the original version of One Piece, Luffy is shown to be immune to bullets because his body is made of rubber. That is a core part of his character and his powers. But in the 4Kids version, with the guns turned into what look like water guns, the scene instead makes it seem like Luffy is immune to water, which is actually the opposite of how his powers work. Devil Fruit users in One Piece lose the ability to swim and are weakened by water. So the censorship did not just look silly, it actively created confusion about the fundamental rules of the show's universe. Then there was Sanji's cigarette. Sanji, the crew's cook, is almost always seen with a cigarette in his mouth. It is one of the most recognizable parts of his character design, and it connects deeply to his backstory and important emotional moments later in the series. During the Whole Cake Island arc, there is a powerful scene where Sanji is crying in the rain and cannot even light his cigarette. And that small detail carries a huge amount of emotional weight. But 4Kids replaced his cigarette with a lollipop. So instead of a cool, suave chef with a bit of an edge, viewers got a grown man sucking on a lollipop in the middle of serious conversations and battles. The censorship of blood was just as bad. One Piece is a fighting anime. Characters get punched, kicked, slashed, and beaten constantly. Blood is a natural part of those scenes, and in some cases, blood is actually important to the plot. During the Alabasta arc, Luffy is fighting the villain Crocodile, who can turn his body into sand. The only way to hit Crocodile is to wet him down first. When Luffy runs out of water, he figures out that he can use his own blood to make his fists wet enough to land punches. It is a simple but brilliant solution that shows how clever Luffy can be, even in the middle of a desperate fight. But in the 4Kids version, all the blood was removed from the show entirely. Every fight, every injury, every dramatic wound was either edited out or digitally painted over, and the Luffy versus Crocodile blood scene lost all of its meaning. But the censorship went far beyond just cleaning up violence. 4Kids made changes to the actual story that created permanent plot holes and destroyed some of the most emotional moments in the series. The single most damaging change they made was to Nami's backstory. In the original One Piece, Nami's adopted mother Belle-Mère is killed by the villain Arlong. He shoots her in front of her daughters because she cannot afford to pay the tax he demands from the villagers. It is one of the most heartbreaking moments in the entire East Blue saga, and it is the foundation of Nami's entire character. Her pain, her anger, her desperate need to buy back her village's freedom, all of it stems from watching her mother die. In the 4Kids dub, Arlong does not kill Belle-Mère. He sends her to a dungeon. She is just locked away somewhere, alive and well. This single change completely destroyed the emotional core of the arc. If Belle-Mère is alive in a dungeon somewhere, then why does Nami never go rescue her after Arlong is defeated? Why does the village act like she is gone forever? The change made no sense and created a massive plot hole that the dub had no way of fixing. It took one of the most powerful story moments in One Piece and turned it into something confusing and hollow. And 4Kids did not stop at just censoring scenes. They cut entire story arcs out of the show completely. The Reverse Mountain arc, the Warship Island arc, and the Little Garden arc were all skipped over entirely. These were not minor side stories either. Reverse Mountain is where the crew enters the Grand Line for the first time, which is one of the most important milestones in the entire series. And more importantly, Reverse Mountain is where the Straw Hat crew meets a whale named Laboon. Laboon is a whale who has been waiting at the entrance to the Grand Line for decades, hoping that a crew of pirates who promised to come back for him would one day return. The Straw Hats promise to see Laboon again, and Luffy even paints their Jolly Roger on Laboon's head as a symbol of that promise. Now, Laboon might seem like a small detail in the early parts of the story, but he becomes incredibly important later. When the Straw Hats meet Brook, the skeleton musician who joins their crew during the Thriller Bark arc, his entire backstory and his main dream in life are connected to Laboon. Brook was part of the pirate crew that originally promised to return to Laboon, and after his crew died and he was left alone for 50 years, his only reason for continuing to exist was to fulfill that promise and see Laboon again. It is one of the most emotional character stories in all of One Piece. But 4Kids cut Laboon out of the show entirely. In their version, instead of meeting a whale at the Grand Line entrance, the crew just crashes through an iceberg. If the 4Kids dub had continued long enough to reach Thriller Bark, Brook's character would have made absolutely no sense because the emotional core of his story had been completely erased. On top of all the cuts and censorship, 4Kids also replaced the entire original soundtrack. One Piece has one of the best musical scores in anime, composed by Kohei Tanaka and Shiro Hamaguchi. The music sets the tone for everything in the show, from the quiet emotional moments to the big explosive battles. 4Kids threw all of that away and replaced it with their own generic music that sounded like it belonged in a cheap video game. The music rarely matched the tone of the scenes it was played over, and big emotional moments that should have hit hard fell completely flat because the wrong track was playing behind them. And of course, there was the infamous opening theme. The original One Piece openings are iconic songs that fans love. 4Kids replaced all of them with a rap called the Pirate Rap, which is widely considered one of the worst dubbed anime theme songs ever created. The voice acting was also a problem for most of the cast. While a couple of voice actors did deliver solid performances, including Mark Derazan as Zoro, the overall quality was inconsistent. Luffy's voice in the 4Kids dub was a high-pitched, screechy performance that made the character hard to take seriously. Sanji spoke in an exaggerated Brooklyn accent that did not fit the character at all. Many fans found the voice work irritating, and compared to the original Japanese performances, the 4Kids cast mostly fell short. 4Kids also went out of their way to remove any trace of Japanese culture from the show, which is ironic because One Piece is deeply rooted in Japanese storytelling traditions. They changed character names, altered food items, and made everything feel as generic and Western as possible. Onigiri, the rice balls that play a meaningful role in Zoro's backstory, and even connect to the name of one of his signature sword techniques, were changed to cookies. Sanji's boss Zeph ran a floating restaurant in the middle of the ocean, which in the original is clearly Japanese inspired, but 4Kids stripped all of that cultural identity away. The 4Kids dub of One Piece ran from 2004 to 2006, covering only up to the Alabasta arc before the company canceled it. The final scene of their version was shockingly dark for a show they had been desperately trying to make child-friendly. When the dub ended, it did so abruptly, and the lasting damage was already done. American viewers who only knew One Piece through the 4Kids version thought the show was a goofy, poorly made kids cartoon. It left such a bad impression that many people in the West actively avoided One Piece for years afterward, even after Funimation took over the license in 2007 and started producing a faithful, uncensored English dub that respected the source material. The 4Kids dub played a direct role in One Piece being significantly less popular in North America compared to Europe and Asia, where the show was a cultural giant. While Naruto and later Dragon Ball dominated the American anime conversation, One Piece was pushed to the sidelines, still carrying the stain of that terrible first impression. Some former 4Kids employees have even admitted that the One Piece dub was an extreme case that permanently damaged the company's reputation, and it was one of the factors that contributed to 4Kids eventually filing for bankruptcy in 2011. It took years for One Piece to recover in the West. The Funimation dub, the growth of streaming platforms like Crunchyroll, and eventually the Netflix live-action show all helped repair the damage. But you have to wonder how different things might have been if One Piece had received a proper English dub from the beginning. How many millions of fans might have discovered the show a decade earlier? How much bigger could the Western fan base have been? We will never know, because 4Kids took one of the greatest anime ever made and turned it into something almost unrecognizable. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But even if the 4Kids dub had never existed, even if every English-speaking viewer had access to the original Japanese version from day one, they still would have run into a problem that has frustrated fans since the very beginning of the show, and that is the painfully slow opening act that asks you to sit through dozens of episodes before the story truly finds its footing. Section 3. The East Blue Slow Burn. Losing viewers before it begins. So let us say someone actually decides to give One Piece a shot. They have accepted the massive episode. They have found the proper version of the show, not the butchered 4Kids dub, but the real thing with subtitles, or the Funimation English dub. They sit down, press play on episode 1, and they are ready to see what all the hype is about. They have heard people call One Piece one of the greatest stories ever told. They have seen clips online of jaw-dropping fights, emotional moments that make grown adults cry, and a world so rich and detailed that fans have spent decades exploring it. They are expecting something amazing. And then they get a boy in a straw hat, sitting in a barrel floating in the ocean. The East Blue Saga is the very first part of One Piece. It runs for 61 episodes in the anime, and its job is to introduce you to the main character, Monkey D. Luffy, and the first 5 members of his pirate crew. Over the course of these 61 episodes, you meet Zoro the swordsman, Nami the navigator, Usopp the sniper, and Sanji the cook. Each of them gets their own story arc where their backstory is revealed, they face some kind of personal struggle, and they eventually decide to join Luffy on his journey to become the king of the pirates. It is foundational storytelling. It is the setup for everything that comes later. And for a lot of new viewers, it is where they stop watching One Piece forever. The problem is not that the East Blue Saga is bad. Most fans who have gotten through the entire series will tell you that it is actually quite good, and that it does an excellent job of building the emotional connections between the characters that pay off hundreds of episodes later. The problem is context. When you are staring down a mountain of over 1,100 episodes, and the first 61 of those episodes are relatively small-scale adventures on tiny islands in the weakest sea in the One Piece world, it can feel like the show is never going to get to the good stuff. And for viewers who are used to modern anime that hooks you in the first episode with a massive battle or a shocking twist, One Piece's slow and steady approach to its opening act feels painfully outdated. The very first arc of the series is the Romance Dawn arc, and it covers Luffy's childhood, his relationship with the pirate Shanks, and his very first steps as a pirate. It is charming, and it sets up important themes about dreams, sacrifice, and freedom that carry through the entire series. But it is also very simple, very goofy, and very clearly aimed at a younger audience. The villains in these early episodes are not threatening. The stakes feel low, and the tone is so lighthearted and cartoonish that many new viewers struggle to take the show seriously. They have heard that One Piece deals with heavy topics like government tyranny, the corruption of justice, and the meaning of true freedom. But none of that is on display in these first few episodes. What they get instead is a rubber boy punching a clown in the face and laughing about it. The second arc, the Orange Town arc, introduces the villain Buggy the Clown. Now, Buggy actually becomes one of the most important and entertaining characters in the entire series later on. His journey from a joke villain to someone who accidentally stumbles his way into becoming one of the most powerful figures in the world is one of the funniest long-running storylines in One Piece. But when you first meet him, he is just a loud, angry clown who can split his body apart. And the arc plays out like a simple kid's adventure. There is a nice emotional story about a dog protecting his dead owner's shop and a mayor who loves his town. But for viewers who are expecting epic pirate battles and complex world building, it can feel like a letdown. Then comes the Syrup Village arc, and this is the one that causes the most damage. If there is a single arc in the early parts of One Piece that is responsible for turning away new viewers, it is Syrup Village. This arc introduces Usopp, the crew's eventual sniper, and tells the story of a quiet village being targeted by a pirate named Captain Kuro, who has been disguising himself as a butler for 3 years while plotting to steal a young girl's fortune. The arc is not terrible. Usopp's character development is solid, and his relationship with Kaya, the sick girl he tells stories to, has some genuinely sweet moments. But the pacing is slow, the action is limited, and the villain, while he has a decent backstory, is not particularly exciting to watch. For viewers who are already on the fence about whether One Piece is worth the time investment, Syrup Village often pushes them over the edge. Many fans who have been through the entire series and look back on their experience will point to Syrup Village as the arc where they almost quit. The show had not yet proven itself. The world still felt small. The fights were not impressive compared to what was coming. And with over 1,000 episodes still ahead of them, the idea of sitting through more arcs like this one was simply not appealing. Online discussions about One Piece are filled with people asking questions like, does it get better after Syrup Village? And when does One Piece actually get good? And the fact that those questions are so common tells you everything you need to know about how the early episodes land with new viewers. Things do improve with the Baratier arc, which introduces Sanji and features the first truly impactful moment of world building in the series. This is the arc where Zoro fights Dracule Mihawk, the greatest swordsman in the world, and gets absolutely destroyed. It is a scene that shows the viewer for the first time just how big the gap is between the Straw Hat crew and the real powers in the One Piece world. It is a genuinely great moment, and it hints at the kind of storytelling the series is capable of. But even the Baratier arc has its weak points. The main villain, Don Krieg, is widely considered one of the least interesting antagonists in the entire series. His fight with Luffy is long and not particularly thrilling, and the arc drags in places. The real turning point of the East Blue Saga is the Arlong Park arc, and this is the part where most fans say they finally got hooked on One Piece. Arlong Park is where the show proves it can deliver real emotional weight. Nami's backstory is revealed in this arc, and it is devastating. You learn that she grew up under the control of a brutal fishman pirate named Arlong, who conquered her village when she was a child. He killed her adopted mother right in front of her, and forced her to work as his personal map maker, drawing charts for him in exchange for a promise that she could eventually buy her village's freedom. She spent her entire childhood and teenage years stealing money and doing everything she could to save up enough to free her people, only to have Arlong betray her at the last moment by having a corrupt marine captain steal all of her savings. The scene where Nami finally breaks down, stabbing at the Arlong pirate's tattoo on her arm in desperation and rage, then turns to Luffy and asks him for help, is one of the most iconic moments in the entire series. Luffy puts his straw hat on her head and walks off to fight Arlong without saying a word, and the whole crew follows him. It is powerful. It is the first time the show makes you feel something deep in your chest, and it is the moment that turned millions of casual viewers into lifelong fans. But here is the problem. Arlong Park does not start until episode 31. That means a new viewer has to sit through 30 episodes of relatively low-stakes, goofy pirate adventures before the show delivers its first truly great arc. 30 episodes. At roughly 22 minutes each, that is about 11 hours of watching. 11 hours before the show proves it can be something special. And in today's world where people have endless options for entertainment and most shows try to hook you within the first episode or two, asking someone to invest 11 hours before the payoff is a very tough sell. And even after Arlong Park, the East Blue saga is not done yet. There is still the Logtown arc, which is a shorter and mostly enjoyable arc that wraps up the crew's time in the East Blue before they head to the Grand Line. But before Logtown, the anime throws in its very first filler arc, the Warship Island arc. This is a completely original story that was not in the manga, and it involves the Straw Hats rescuing a young girl named Apis, who can talk to dragons and needs help returning a sick dragon to its homeland. The Warship Island arc is not offensively bad, but it is painfully mediocre, and its placement in the series could not be worse. You have just finished Arlong Park, which was the first time the show really grabbed you, and instead of carrying that momentum forward into the Grand Line, the anime hits the brakes and drops you into a filler story about a girl and a dragon that has absolutely no impact on the rest of the series. None of the characters from this arc ever appear again. The island itself is never mentioned again, and to make things worse, the arc actually contradicts later canon events. In the Warship Island arc, the Straw Hats encounter a dragon, but when they arrive at Punk Hazard hundreds of episodes later, the characters act like they have never seen a dragon before. It is a small detail, but it is the kind of inconsistency that filler arcs create, and it is annoying for viewers who are paying close attention. The Warship Island filler is also where a lot of viewers who are on the verge of quitting during Surut Village, but stuck around because of Arlong Park, decide to finally drop off. They pushed through the slow early arcs, they were rewarded with one great story, and then the show immediately pumped the brakes again with a filler arc that goes nowhere. It sends the message that One Piece is going to keep wasting your time, and for viewers who are already anxious about the 1,100 episodes ahead of them, that message is enough to make them walk away. Now, it is worth saying that the East Blue saga does look better in hindsight. Once you have watched the entire series, you can look back at those early arcs and appreciate how much groundwork they laid. Characters like Buggy, Alvida, Smoker, and even Kobe, who all appear in the East Blue, become major players later in the story. Small details that seemed unimportant, like the mention of the 7 warlords during Baratie, or the brief appearance of Luffy's father Dragon in Logtown, turn out to be massive plot points that shape the entire series. Oda planted seeds in the East Blue that he would not harvest for 500 or even 800 episodes. And when those payoffs finally arrive, they are incredible. But you can only appreciate that if you stuck around long enough to see it, and a lot of people did not. The animation during the East Blue saga has also aged quite a bit. The show started airing in 1999, and while the art style had a charm to it that many longtime fans love, it looks noticeably dated compared to modern anime. New viewers who are used to the sharp, fluid animation of shows like Demon Slayer or Jujutsu Kaisen might find One Piece's early episodes rough to look at. The character designs are simpler, the action scenes are less dynamic, and the overall production quality is clearly from a different era. This is not a criticism of the art team that worked on those early episodes. They did the best they could with the tools and budget they had at the time. But it is another barrier that new viewers have to get past. And when you combine dated visuals with slow pacing and low stakes, It makes those first 61 episodes feel like a chore for a lot of people. The East Blue Saga asks you to trust it. It asks you to believe that these goofy little island adventures are building towards something greater, that these characters are going to grow into legends, and that the world is going to expand into something you cannot even imagine right now. And it is right. Everything the East Blue Saga promises, One Piece delivers on 100 times over. But asking a new viewer to sit through 61 episodes of setup when they have over 1,000 more to go after that is one of the biggest reasons people call this show unwatchable. The early hours of One Piece test your patience in a way that very few other anime series do, and not everyone passes that test. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But even if you do make it through the East Blue, even if you fall in love with the characters and decide you are in it for the long haul, there is a much bigger structural problem waiting for you on the other side of the Grand Line. Because the way Toei Animation chose to adapt the manga into the anime created a pacing issue so severe that it fundamentally changed what it feels like to watch this show. And it all comes down to one simple decision that broke everything. Section 4. One chapter, one episode. The policy that broke the anime. Every single problem with the One Piece anime's pacing can be traced back to one decision. It is not a complicated decision. It is not something that requires a deep understanding of how animation works or how television is produced. It is incredibly simple. And that simplicity is what makes it so frustrating. At some point during the show's run, Toei Animation settled into a pattern of adapting roughly one manga chapter per anime episode. One chapter in, one episode out. And that single choice is the reason the One Piece anime feels the way it does. To understand why this matters, you need to understand how the relationship between a manga and its anime adaptation works. The One Piece manga is the original version of the story. It is written and drawn by Eiichiro Oda, and it has been published weekly in a Japanese magazine called Weekly Shonen Jump since 1997. Every week, Oda releases a new chapter that moves the story forward. Each chapter is roughly 17 to 19 pages long, and a skilled reader can get through a single chapter in about 5 to 10 minutes. The anime is an adaptation of that manga. Toei Animation takes the chapters Oda has written and turns them into animated episodes that air on television in Japan, also on a weekly schedule. Now here is where the problems start. The manga and the anime both release on a weekly schedule, but Oda takes regular breaks. He might release 3 chapters in a row and then take a week off. Sometimes he takes 2 weeks off. Sometimes there are longer breaks for holidays or for his health. On average, Oda puts out somewhere around 36 to 40 chapters per year. But the anime does not take those same breaks. For most of its run, One Piece has aired nearly every single week of the year, with only a handful of breaks scattered throughout. That means the anime produces somewhere around 45 to 48 episodes per year, while the manga only produces around 36 to 40 chapters per year. The anime is creating more episodes than the manga is creating chapters. This creates a very obvious problem. If the anime adapts the manga chapters too quickly, it will eventually catch up to where the manga currently is in the story. And if the anime catches up to the manga, there is nothing left to adapt. The show would either have to stop airing and wait for Oda to write more chapters, or it would have to start making up its own story that is not in the manga. Neither of those options is good. Stopping a weekly show for months at a time risks losing viewers and sponsors. Making up original stories risks contradicting what Oda has planned for the actual plot. So the anime needs to find a way to slow itself down and stay behind the manga at all times. Other long-running anime series solve this problem using filler. Naruto, for example, is famous for its enormous amount of filler episodes. Entire seasons of Naruto are completely original stories that have nothing to do with the main plot, and they exist purely to give the manga time to get further ahead. Bleach did the same thing, inserting long filler arcs in between the canon story arcs. These filler arcs were often boring and fans hated them, but they served their purpose. They kept the anime from catching up to the manga, and when the filler was over, the show went back to adapting the real story at a normal pace. One Piece took a different approach. Instead of using large amounts of filler to create distance between the anime and the manga, Toei decided to slow down the adaptation itself. Rather than adapting 2 or 3 chapters per episode, which was the standard in the earlier parts of the series, they gradually reduced the amount of manga content in each episode until they reached the point where a single episode covers a single
chapter, and sometimes even less than that.
In the early days of the anime, the pacing was actually quite reasonable. During the Alabasta arc, for example, the anime adapted 69 manga chapters into 39 episodes. That means, on average, each episode covered nearly 2 chapters worth of story.
Things moved at a brisk pace.
Scenes did not overstay their welcome. Events that were supposed to feel fast and urgent actually felt fast and urgent. If you go back and watch the early arcs of One Piece, you can feel the difference immediately. The show has energy, things happen. The story progresses in a meaningful way from one episode to the next. But as the series went on and the anime started getting closer to the manga's current chapter, the ratio began to shift. By the time the story reached the Marineford arc, which is around the halfway point of the series, the chapter to episode count was nearly even. The anime was adapting roughly 1 chapter per episode, and you could feel the change. Scenes that took 2 pages in the manga were being stretched to fill 5 or 6 minutes of screen time. Characters would stare at each other for longer. Reaction shots would linger. Walking scenes would go on and on. The story was still moving forward, but it was moving forward at a crawl. And then came Dressrosa, and the pacing went from bad to something that a lot of fans would describe as nearly unwatchable. The Dressrosa arc in the manga runs for 102 chapters. That is already long. Dressrosa is one of the longest arcs in the entire manga, and even some manga readers felt it went on a bit too long. But the anime turned those 102 chapters into 118 episodes. Let that sink in for a moment. There are more anime episodes than there are manga chapters for this arc. That means, on average, each episode adapted less than 1 chapter. The anime was actually moving slower than the manga, which should not even be possible. If you sat down to watch the Dressrosa arc in the anime, you would be committing to roughly 40 hours of viewing time. A manga reader can get through the same story in about 8 to 10 hours, 4 to 5 times faster, telling the exact same story with the exact same content. The fan project One Pace, which re-edits the anime to match the manga's pacing, managed to cut Dressrosa down to 48 episodes. And even at 48 episodes, with some of those running longer than the standard 23 minutes, every single important moment from the arc was included. Nothing of real value was lost. That means roughly 70 episodes of the original Dressrosa arc were padding. 70 episodes. That is more episodes of pure padding than most anime series have in their entire run. This problem did not stop at Dressrosa. It carried forward into every arc that followed. Whole Cake Island, which came after Dressrosa, had the same issue. The Wano Country arc, which many fans consider to be too long even in the manga, was stretched even further in the anime, running for nearly 200 episodes. And while Wano did feature some genuinely beautiful animation and incredible standout moments, the overall pacing was still painfully slow for most of its run. The reason this 1 chapter per episode approach is so damaging is because of what it forces the anime production team to do with each episode. A single chapter of One Piece manga contains roughly 17 to 19 pages of content. When you strip away the title page and any recap panels, you are looking at about 15 pages of actual story. That is enough content to fill maybe 8 to 10 minutes of animation if you adapt it faithfully. But an anime episode needs to fill roughly 22 minutes of runtime, and that is before you account for the opening theme, the ending theme, the recap, and the commercial break bumpers. Once you subtract all of those elements, you are left with about 15 to 17 minutes of actual episode content that needs to be filled with roughly 8 to 10 minutes worth of manga material. So how do you fill the gap? You stretch everything. A character walking across a room that takes 1 panel in the manga becomes a 30-second scene in the anime. A reaction shot that is a single small drawing in the corner of a manga page becomes a 5-second close-up of a character's face with dramatic music playing. A fight that moves quickly on the page, with punches and kicks flying across panels in rapid succession, gets slowed down so that every single hit is drawn out with long pauses between each attack. Conversations get padded with extra lines of dialogue that were not in the manga. Flashbacks get inserted to remind you of things that happened a few episodes ago, and the pacing of the entire episode slows to a speed that makes it feel like the story is barely moving forward at all. This is not something the production team does because they are lazy or because they do not care about the quality of the show. They do it because they have no choice. The schedule demands a new episode every single week, and there is only so much manga content available to adapt. They cannot go faster without catching up to the manga. They cannot take extended breaks without losing their time slot on Japanese television. And they cannot create large amounts of filler because the show has built its identity around being a mostly faithful adaptation of the manga. They are stuck in a system that forces them to produce content at a pace that is fundamentally incompatible with delivering a well-paced viewing experience. And this is where it gets really frustrating, because there is a solution, and everyone knows what it is. The solution is to make One Piece a seasonal anime. Instead of airing 48 episodes per year every single year with no breaks, the show could air in seasons of 12 to 25 episodes, take a break for several months to let the manga get further ahead, and then come back with another batch of episodes are properly paced and beautifully animated. This is exactly what shows like My Hero Academia, Demon Slayer, Attack on Titan, and Jujutsu Kaisen do, and the quality difference is obvious. Those shows adapt multiple chapters per episode, move at a pace that keeps viewers engaged, and deliver animation quality that blows weekly One Piece episodes out of the water. But One Piece does not do this. And the reason comes down to business rather than creativity. One Piece airs on Fuji TV in Japan, and it has been airing on that network since it moved to its current Sunday morning time slot. Fuji TV wants new episodes every week. One Piece is one of their biggest properties, and having a new episode ready to broadcast every single Sunday is how the network generates consistent advertising revenue and keeps viewers tuned in. The network does not want to take the show off the air for months at a time and risk losing that audience. From a business perspective, the weekly model makes sense. From a storytelling and quality perspective, it has been slowly strangling the anime for years. There is hope on the horizon, though. Toei Animation announced a project called The One Piece, which is a complete remake of the anime that will be produced by Wit Studio, the same studio that animated the early seasons of Attack on Titan. While not much is known about the format yet, many fans are hoping it will take a seasonal approach that fixes the pacing problems that have plagued the original anime for decades. If the One Piece adapts the manga at a proper pace, it could potentially tell the entire story in a fraction of the episodes, and that would be the version of the anime that the story has always deserved. But until that project arrives, the original anime is still what most people have access to, and the one chapter per episode pacing is baked into the DNA of the show from roughly the Marineford era onward. It affects every single aspect of the viewing experience. It makes fast moments feel slow. It makes exciting moments feel tedious. It makes arcs that should take 20 hours to watch take 40 hours instead. And it is the reason why so many people who try to watch One Piece eventually give up and either switch to the manga or walk away from the series entirely. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The one chapter per episode approach is the root cause, but it creates a chain reaction of specific problems that show up in every single episode of the anime. And the most immediate and obvious of those problems is something that hits you before the episode even properly begins. Something so annoying and so consistent that it has become one of the most complained about aspects of the entire show. And that is the way every episode wastes your time before it even starts telling you anything new. Section 5. Double intros, recaps, and the 15-minute episode. If the one chapter per episode policy is the disease, then what happens at the start of every episode is the most visible symptom. Because before the One Piece anime even begins to tell you something new, before a single piece of the story moves forward, it wastes a shocking amount of your time. And when you are watching a show that already stretches its content thinner than it should be, those wasted minutes at the start of every single episode add up to something genuinely painful. Let us walk through what a typical One Piece episode actually looks like from the moment you press play. First, you get a cold open. This is usually a short scene, sometimes only 30 seconds, sometimes a minute or two, that either teases something from the upcoming episode or replays a dramatic moment from the previous one. Then, for hundreds and hundreds of episodes in the middle stretch of the series, you get not one, but two opening sequences. The first is a narration recap that plays over clips from recent episodes, reminding you where the story currently stands. It tells you what happened in the last few episodes, who the characters are, and what the current conflict is about. This narration can run anywhere from 1 to 3 minutes depending on the arc. And then after that, you get the actual opening theme song, which runs for about a minute and a half. So before the episode has even started its new content, you have already sat through a cold open, a narrated recap sequence, and a full opening theme. That alone eats up roughly 3 to 5 minutes, but it does not stop there. After the opening theme plays, the episode then launches into yet another recap. This one is different from the narrated sequence that played before the opening. This is a direct replay of scenes from the end of the previous episode, sometimes showing you the exact same footage you watched just a week ago, or just 22 minutes ago if you are binging. This second recap can run anywhere from 2 to 4 minutes, and in some of the worst cases during the longer arcs, it can stretch even longer. Then there is the eye catch, which is the short bumper that plays before and after the commercial break in the middle of the episode. There are 2 of these per episode, and while each one is only a few seconds long, they are still dead time where nothing happens. And finally, at the end of the episode, you get the ending theme and a preview for the next episode. The ending theme runs for about 1.5 minutes, and the preview adds another 30 seconds or so. Now let us do the math. A standard anime episode has a total runtime of roughly 22 to 24 minutes. Out of that total runtime, the opening theme takes about 1.5 minutes, the ending theme takes about 1.5 minutes, the narrated recap before the opening takes 1 to 3 minutes. The scene recap after the opening takes 2 to 4 minutes. The eye catches take a few seconds each. The next episode preview takes about 30 seconds. When you add all of that up, you are looking at anywhere from 7 to 10 minutes of non-content in every single episode. That means on a good day, you are getting about 15 to 17 minutes of actual new content per episode. And on a bad day, particularly during the longer arcs where the recaps stretch further, you might be getting closer to 13 or 14 minutes of new story. 13 to 14 minutes. Out of a 22 to 24 minute episode. That means nearly half of some episodes is just replaying things you have already seen, playing theme songs, or showing you bumpers. And remember, the new content that does make it into those remaining minutes is itself being stretched because of the 1 chapter per episode pacing. So you are not even getting a packed, fast-moving 15 minutes of new story. You are getting 15 minutes of already padded content, which means the actual amount of meaningful plot progression in a single One Piece episode can sometimes be measured in just a handful of minutes. This is something that affects the show differently depending on how you are watching it. If you are a weekly viewer in Japan who watches 1 episode every Sunday morning, the recaps serve a purpose. It has been 7 days since the last episode, and a quick reminder of what happened can help you get back into the story. The opening and ending themes are part of the television experience, and skipping them is not always an option when you are watching the show live on broadcast television. For weekly viewers, the padding is annoying, but somewhat understandable. But most people who are watching One Piece today are not weekly viewers. They are people who are trying to catch up on a show with over 1,100 episodes, and they are watching multiple episodes in a row. When you are binging One Piece, the recaps become absolutely unbearable. You just finished an episode 30 seconds ago. You know exactly what happened. You do not need to be reminded. And yet every single episode opens by showing you footage you literally just watched. When you are watching 5 or 6 episodes in a sitting, you end up seeing the same scenes replayed 3 or 4 times across consecutive episodes. The same dialogue, the same dramatic moments, the same reaction shots, played over and over and over again. And this is not a minor complaint. This is hundreds of hours of recycled content spread across the entire series. If you estimate that the average One Piece episode wastes about 5 minutes on recaps alone, not counting the openings and endings, and you multiply that across over 1,100 episodes, you get roughly 5,500 minutes of recap content. That is over 91 hours. 91 hours of your life spent watching scenes you have already seen, being reminded of things you already know, being told information you were literally just told in the episode you finished 2 minutes ago. That is nearly 4 full days of nothing but recaps. 4 days. The most frustrating part is that Toei Animation has proven with their own work that all of this padding is completely unnecessary. When Toei went back and remastered the Fishman Island story arc, they took a stretch of the anime that originally ran for 58 episodes and condensed it down to 21 episodes. They cut out the repeated recaps, the stretched scenes, the padded conversations, and the unnecessary reaction shots, and they still managed to include every single piece of important story information from the arc. nothing was lost. The story was the same, the character moments were the same, the emotional beats were the same. The only thing that changed was that it moved at a pace that actually respected the viewer's time. Going from 58 episodes to 21 means they cut the arc by nearly 2/3. 2/3 of that arc was padding. If you were someone who sat through all 58 episodes of Fishman Island when it originally aired, you spent roughly 37 episodes watching content that did not need to exist. That is over 13 hours of your time that was wasted on inflated content. And Fishman Island is not even considered one of the worst paced arcs in the series. Dressrosa, Whole Cake Island, and Wano all have even worse pacing problems than Fishman Island did. This remastering experiment proves something that fans had been saying for years. The One Piece anime could be significantly shorter without losing anything of value. The story is all there. The manga provides more than enough material to fill episodes with meaningful content. The problem is entirely artificial. The padding exists because the anime needs to fill a weekly time slot without catching up to the manga. And the easiest way to do that is to recycle old footage, stretch new footage, and surround the actual content with as many non-story elements as possible. Now, some fans have taken matters into their own hands. The One Piece project, which we mentioned earlier, is a fan-made re-edit of the entire One Piece anime that removes all of the padding, filler, and stretched content to bring the anime's pacing in line with the manga. One Piece trims episodes down, cuts out the excessive recaps, removes the lingering reaction shots, and condenses scenes that were unnecessarily drawn out. The results are dramatic. Arcs that take 100 or more episodes in the official anime get cut down to 40 or 50 episodes in One Piece, and the viewing experience improves immensely. The story flows better, the tension stays intact, and you actually feel like the plot is moving forward at a reasonable pace. But here's the problem with One Piece. It is an unofficial fan project. You cannot find it on Crunchyroll or any other official streaming platform. Finding and watching One Piece requires effort that most casual viewers are not going to put in. If someone opens up their streaming app and starts watching One Piece, they are watching the official version with all of its padding intact. And that official version is going to test their patience in ways that most other anime shows simply do not. The double intro and recap problem is something that hits particularly hard during the longer arcs, and One Piece has some very long arcs. When you are in the middle of Dressrosa, which runs for 118 episodes, and every single one of those episodes starts with several minutes of recap, the cumulative effect is exhausting. You start to feel like the show is actively working against you. You want to see what happens next. You want the story to move forward. But the anime keeps pulling you backward, replaying things you already know, reminding you of details you have not forgotten, and eating into the already limited time it has to actually progress the plot. And it is not just the recaps at the beginning of episodes that waste time. The anime also has a habit of inserting recaps and flashbacks into the middle of episodes. A character will mention another character's name, and suddenly the show cuts to a flashback of something that character did 3 episodes ago, or 3 arcs ago, as if the viewer has completely forgotten who they are and what they did. These mid-episode flashbacks can eat up 2 or 3 additional minutes per episode, and they are especially common during the longer arcs, where the show is desperately trying to fill time. During the Reverie arc, which covers events happening at a world meeting attended by leaders from different kingdoms, virtually every episode featured extended flashback sequences for every single character that appeared on screen. A king from a country the Straw Hats visited 400 episodes ago would show up for 30 seconds of new content, and then the anime would cut to a 3-minute flashback reminding you who this person is and what happened when the Straw Hats visited their country. It happened over and over again, for nearly every character, even characters that fans remembered perfectly well. The result was an arc that should have been fast-paced and exciting, full of political tension and major revelations, but instead felt bloated and repetitive. The weekly broadcast format is at the heart of all of this. One Piece airs on Sunday mornings in Japan on Fuji TV, and the show has been in that time slot for years. Fuji TV expects a new episode every week, and the production team has to deliver one, whether they have enough new manga content to fill it or not. There is no option to say, we don't have enough material this week, let's skip a week. The episode has to go out. And when you only have 1 chapter's worth of material to work with, you pad the beginning with recaps, you stretch every scene in the middle, and you end on a cliffhanger that will get replayed at the start of the next episode. It is a cycle that repeats itself every single week, and it has been going on for over 2 decades. The contrast between One Piece and modern seasonal anime is stark. A show like Demon Slayer or Jujutsu Kaisen adapts multiple chapters per episode, fills the entire runtime with new content, and delivers episodes that feel packed with story progression from start to finish. These shows do not need 5-minute recaps because they air in concentrated seasons where viewers remember what happened in the previous episode. They do not need to stretch scenes because they have more than enough manga content to fill each episode naturally. They do not waste the viewer's time because their production schedule allows them to focus on quality over quantity. One Piece, trapped in its weekly format, cannot compete with that. And the result is an anime where pressing play on a new episode often feels like watching the same content you already watched, just rearranged slightly, with maybe 5 or 6 minutes of genuinely new material squeezed in somewhere in the middle. For fans who love the story and are willing to put up with it, this is a frustrating but tolerable annoyance. For new viewers who are trying to get through over 1,000 episodes, it is one of the biggest reasons they eventually give up. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But even when the anime is not replaying old content, even in those precious minutes where it is actually showing you something new, there is still another layer of padding that has nothing to do with recaps or opening themes. Because One Piece does not just waste time at the edges of its episodes. It also fills its canon story arcs with entire stretches of content that were never in the manga and were never meant to be part of the story at all. Section 6. Filler arcs and canon contradictions. Every long-running anime has filler. It is just part of the deal when a show runs for years and years and needs to avoid catching up to the manga it is based on. Naruto is probably the most famous example. That show has entire seasons of filler, long stretches of episodes where the main story completely stops, and the characters go on random side adventures that have nothing to do with anything. Bleach did the same thing, dropping in filler arcs that could run for 20 or 30 episodes at a time, right in the middle of major story moments. Fans of those shows learned to identify which episodes were filler and skip them entirely, because watching them added nothing to the overall experience. One Piece handles filler differently than Naruto and Bleach, and the way it handles it is both a strength and a weakness. On the strength side, One Piece has a much lower percentage of filler compared to those other shows. Out of over 1,155 episodes, roughly 100 of them are classified as filler. That comes out to about 9%, which is quite low for a long-running anime. Naruto sits at over 40% filler. Bleach is somewhere in the mid-40s as well. So in terms of pure numbers, One Piece has far less filler than its peers, and that is something the show deserves credit for. But here is the weakness. Because One Piece chose to minimize filler and instead stretch the canon content to fill time, the filler arcs that do exist tend to land at the worst possible moments. They pop up right after a major story arc ends, just when the viewer's excitement is at its peak and they want to see what happens next. Instead of carrying that momentum into the next chapter of the story, the anime hits the brakes and drops you into a completely unrelated side adventure that has no connection to the main plot and no impact on anything that comes after. The very first filler arc in the series is the Warship Island arc, which comes right after the East Blue saga. We talked about this briefly in the last section about the East Blue, but it is worth going deeper here, because Warship Island is a perfect example of everything wrong with One Piece filler. The arc tells the story of a young girl named Apis, who has a special ability that lets her communicate with animals. The Straw Hats help her return a sick dragon to its homeland. They fight a forgettable villain named Eric, and then the arc ends and nothing from it ever comes up again. Apis never appears again. The island is never mentioned again. The dragon is never referenced again. It is a completely disposable story that exists purely to fill airtime. But the real problem with the Warship Island arc is not just that it is forgettable. It is that it actively contradicts things that happen later in the canon story. During this arc, the Straw Hat crew sees a dragon up close. They interact with it. They know what it looks like. But when the Straw Hats arrive at Punk Hazard, which is hundreds of episodes later in the actual canon story, they encounter a dragon and react as if they have never seen one before. This is because the Punk Hazard scene was written by Oda in the manga, where the Warship Island arc does not exist. Oda wrote the crew's reaction to the Punk Hazard dragon as a first encounter because in the manga, it is their first encounter. But the anime had already shown them meeting a dragon in a filler arc that was not supposed to be part of the story. The result is a contradiction that makes attentive viewers scratch their heads and wonder why the characters seem to have amnesia. This kind of contradiction is a recurring problem with filler in One Piece. Because the filler arcs are written by the anime production team and not by Oda himself, they sometimes introduce elements that do not line up with what Oda later writes in the manga. The filler writers do not know what Oda has planned for the future of the story, so they cannot avoid stepping on plot points that have not been revealed yet. And since One Piece is a story where tiny details from hundreds of chapters ago can suddenly become important, the risk of a filler arc accidentally contradicting the real story is always present. After Warship Island, the filler arcs keep coming at regular intervals throughout the first half of the series. The post-Alabasta arc is a short stretch of filler episodes that take place right after the Straw Hats leave the kingdom of Alabasta. These episodes show the crew relaxing and having small adventures on the ship. And while they are harmless enough, they slow down the transition into the next major arc and add nothing of real substance to the story or character. Then there is the Goat Island arc, which drops the Straw Hats on a small island inhabited by an old man and his goats. The crew keeps losing their belongings to the old man in various games and challenges, and the entire arc plays out as a frustrating loop of the characters trying and failing to get their stuff back and leave the island. Nothing meaningful happens, and by the end of the arc, everything is exactly the same as it was before the arc started. It is the definition of filler that wastes the viewer's time. The Reluca Island arc follows a similar pattern. The Straw Hats end up on an island ruled by a dictator who has been taxing the citizens into poverty to fund the construction of a giant tower. It sounds like it could be interesting, but the execution is flat, the villain is not compelling, and the story has zero connection to anything else in One Piece. Like most filler arcs, it ends with the Straw Hats sailing away, and nothing from Reluca Island is ever brought up again. The Ice Hunter arc, also known as the Lovely Land arc, comes after the Enies Lobby story arc, which is widely considered one of the best arcs in the entire series. Enies Lobby is an emotional roller coaster that features some of the most iconic moments in One Piece history, including Robin's desperate cry of wanting to live and the Straw Hats declaring war on the world government. It is a massive high point for the series. And immediately after that high point, the anime gives you a filler arc about bounty hunters on an ice island who steal the Straw Hats' flag. The tonal whiplash is enormous. You go from one of the most intense and emotionally charged stretches of the entire show to a lighthearted filler adventure that feels like it belongs in a completely different series. Now, it is only fair to mention that not all One Piece filler is bad. There is one filler arc that fans almost universally love, and that is the G8 arc. This arc takes place right after the Straw Hats come back down from Skypiea, and it follows them as they accidentally land inside a heavily guarded marine base and have to find a way to escape. The G8 arc is funny, clever, and features a great original character in Captain Jonathan, a calm and intelligent marine commander who actually feels like he could exist in the real One Piece world. Many fans consider G8 to be so good that they wish it were canon, and it is often recommended as essential viewing, even though it is technically filler. G8 proves that filler can work when it is well written, well placed in the story, and respectful of the characters. But G8 is the exception, not the rule. Most One Piece filler arcs range from mediocre to boring, and their placement in the story always disrupts the flow. The Foxy's Return arc, the Ocean's Dream arc, the Spa Island arc, the Cedra Guild arc. These are all short filler stretches that pop up between major story arcs and force the viewer to sit through content that does not matter before they can get back to the story they actually care about. And filler in One Piece is not just limited to entire arcs. There are also individual filler episodes scattered throughout the series, and there are episodes that mix canon content with filler content, making it hard for viewers to know what they can safely skip and what they need to watch. Some episodes are mostly filler, with a small canon scene tucked into the middle. One Piece, the fan re-edit project, identified a canon conversation between the Straw Hats about the condition of their ship, the Going Merry, that was inserted into the middle of episode 203, which is otherwise part of the G8 filler arc. If you skip the entire G8 arc because it is filler, you miss that canon conversation. But if you watch the whole thing because you are not sure what is filler and what is not, you are spending time on content that is not part of the real story. It is a frustrating situation for viewers who just want to experience the actual One Piece story without any detours. The Boss Luffy historical specials are another strange type of filler that One Piece includes. These are episodes that take the Straw Hat characters and drop them into an alternate version of Edo period Japan, with completely different roles and storylines. They are not canon, They do not pretend to be canon. They just appear randomly in the middle of the regular episode run and completely break whatever momentum the story had built up. When these specials first aired, the novelty of seeing the characters in a different setting was mildly entertaining. But now, with the Wano arc having given fans an actual canon story set in a Japanese-inspired country, these old specials have lost even that small appeal. For viewers who are binging through the series and trying to catch up, filler is one of the most annoying obstacles they face. The good news is that filler guides exist online. There are detailed lists that tell you exactly which episodes are filler, which are canon, and which are a mix of both. If you use one of these guides, you can skip the filler entirely and save yourself roughly 37 to 40 hours of watching content that does not contribute to the main story. That is not a small amount of time. That is almost 2 full days of saved viewing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But here is the thing that a lot of people do not realize about One Piece's filler problem. The filler arcs are actually the smaller issue. Yes, they are annoying. Yes, they disrupt the flow of the story. Yes, some of them contradict canon events. But at the end of the day, filler only accounts for about 9% of the total episode count. You can skip it and move on with your life. The much bigger problem is the padding within the canon episodes themselves, the stretched scenes, the extended reaction shots, the lingering pauses, and the slow motion storytelling that turns arcs that should be tight and exciting into exhausting slogs. And nowhere in the entire series is that problem more visible, more painful, and more damaging than in the single arc that became the ultimate symbol of everything wrong with the One Piece anime's pacing. Section 7, Dressrosa, the case study in unwatchable pacing. If you want to understand why people call the One Piece anime unwatchable, you do not need to look at the whole series. You just need to look at one arc, Dressrosa. This single stretch of the anime is the clearest, most painful example of everything wrong with how Toei Animation handles One Piece. It is the arc that made longtime fans give up on the anime. It is the arc that drove people to the manga. It is the arc that spawned fan projects dedicated to fixing the pacing. And it is the arc that proved beyond any doubt that the One Piece anime has a serious problem that it either cannot or will not fix. Dressrosa takes place after the Straw Hats leave Punk Hazard and travel to a kingdom ruled by Don Quixote do Flamengo, one of the most compelling villains in the entire series. Doflamingo is a former world noble who took over the kingdom of Dressrosa by force, overthrew the rightful king, and turned the country's citizens into living toys using the powers of one of his crew members, Sugar, who has the hobby fruit. The people who were turned into toys were erased from everyone's memories. Their families forgot they existed. Their friends forgot they existed. They were forced to serve as slaves while the world moved on without them. It is a deeply dark and emotionally rich premise, and the manga version of Dressrosa is widely considered one of the best arcs in the entire series. In the manga, the Dressrosa arc runs for 102 chapters. That is already long. It is one of the longest arcs Oda has ever written, and even some manga readers felt it could have been trimmed down a bit. But 102 chapters is manageable when you are reading. A fast reader can get through the entire Dressrosa arc in about 8 to 10 hours. The pacing in the manga is solid. Events move forward at a steady clip. Important moments land with impact because they are not buried under layers of padding. It is a great arc that tells a great story. The anime turned those 102 chapters into 118 episodes. 118. That is more episodes than chapters, which means the anime is adapting less than 1 chapter per episode on average. If you sit down to watch the Dressrosa arc in the anime from start to finish, you are committing to approximately 40 hours of viewing time. 40 hours for a story that can be experienced in 8 to 10 hours by reading the manga. That is 4 to 5 times longer, telling the exact same story with the exact same plot points, the exact same characters, and the exact same outcome. The only difference is that everything happens in extreme slow motion. The problems with Dressrosa in the anime start from the very beginning of the arc and never let up. Every episode is padded to an extreme degree. Scenes that take a few panels in the manga, scenes that are meant to be quick and snappy, get stretched out into minutes-long sequences. Characters walk slowly through hallways. They stare at each other for extended periods. They repeat dialogue that was already said in the previous episode. Reaction shots linger on screen for 5, 6, 7 seconds at a time, showing you a character's shocked face from multiple angles while dramatic music plays in the background. None of this is in the manga. All of it was added by the anime to fill time because there was not enough manga content to fill a full episode. The fights in Dressrosa are where the pacing problems become truly unbearable. Fights that are fast and dynamic in the manga, where punches fly and the action moves from panel to panel with energy and momentum, become slow and drawn-out affairs in the anime. A fight that takes 10 pages in the manga and should be adapted into a tight, exciting 5-minute sequence instead gets spread across 2 or 3 full episodes. Characters will throw a single punch and then the anime will cut away to reaction shots of bystanders, then cut to a flashback, then come back to the fight just in time for the next punch, which will be followed by another round of reaction shots
and commentary.
The final battle between Luffy and Doflamingo is one of the worst examples. In the manga, this fight has real weight and urgency to it. Luffy is pushing himself to the absolute limit, burning through his Gear 4th form, and having to take breaks while his body recovers. There is a ticking clock element because Doflamingo's bird cage, a massive cage made of razor-sharp strings that is slowly shrinking and will eventually kill everyone in the kingdom, is closing in. The tension should be incredible. You should feel the desperation in every panel, and in the manga, you do. In the anime, that desperation is completely drained by the pacing. The fight drags on for episode after episode. Scenes of the birdcage shrinking, which should create urgency, instead become repetitive filler as the anime shows the same shots of people pushing against the strings over and over again. Luffy's recovery periods, where he is temporarily unable to fight, get stretched out with extended scenes of side characters running around and not accomplishing much. By the time Luffy finally lands the finishing blow on Doflamingo, weekly viewers had been watching this fight play out for weeks upon weeks, and a lot of the excitement had been replaced by exhaustion and frustration. But perhaps the single most mocked aspect of the Dressrosa anime is what happened with the character Rebecca. Rebecca is a gladiator fighter in the Corrida Coliseum who is fighting to win a powerful devil fruit. She has a tragic backstory involving her father, a toy soldier named Kairos, who was actually a legendary warrior before being turned into a toy by Sugar's powers. It is a genuinely emotional story in the manga, and the reveal of Kairos' true identity is one of the arc's best moments. The problem is that the anime decided to show Rebecca's flashback over and over and over again. Every time Rebecca appeared on screen, the anime would cut to the same flashback scenes of her crying, her father being taken away, and her difficult childhood. Fans who watched Dressrosa weekly began counting how many times the same Rebecca flashback was replayed across the arc, and the number became a running joke in the community. It reached a point where the flashback was no longer emotional. It was no longer sad. It was just annoying. The anime had taken a genuinely touching character moment and beaten it into the ground through sheer repetition until all the emotion had been squeezed out of it. The One Piece Fan Project tells you everything you need to know about how bloated the Dressrosa anime truly is. One Piece took the entire Dressrosa arc and re-edited it, cutting out all the padding, the repeated flashbacks, the stretched scenes, the lingering reaction shots, and the recycled footage. When they were done, they had reduced the arc from 118 episodes to 48 episodes, and some of those 48 episodes ran longer than the standard 23 minutes to make sure nothing important was cut. Every key plot point was preserved. Every important character moment was included. Every major fight played out in full. The only things that were removed were the things that should never have been there in the first place. Going from 118 episodes to 48 means that roughly 70 episodes of the original Dressrosa anime were padding. 70 episodes. That is more padding in a single arc than most anime series have episodes in their entire run. If you watched all 118 episodes of Dressrosa, you spent approximately 26 hours watching content that did not need to exist. 26 hours of your life spent on stretched scenes, repeated flashbacks, and drawn-out reaction shots that added nothing to the story. That is more than a full day of wasted time in just one arc. Dressrosa is the arc that broke the community in a lot of ways. It was during Dressrosa that the conversation around One Piece's pacing shifted from occasional complaints to a constant, unavoidable topic. Before Dressrosa, fans would talk about the pacing being slow, but it was treated as a minor annoyance rather than a fundamental flaw. After Dressrosa, the pacing became the single most discussed criticism of the anime. It was during Dressrosa that large numbers of anime-only fans started switching to the manga, tired of sitting through episodes where barely anything happened. It was during Dressrosa that the One Piece project gained significant popularity, as fans sought out a version of the anime that actually respected their time. And it was during Dressrosa that One Piece's viewership reportedly took a noticeable hit. Fans who had been watching the anime weekly for years started dropping off during this arc. The slow pace, the constant padding, and the lack of meaningful progress in each episode drove people away. Some came back later when the arc finally ended and the story moved into the faster-paced Zou arc. Others never came back at all. The most frustrating thing about Dressrosa is that the story underneath all that padding is genuinely excellent. Doflamingo is one of the best written villains in the entire series. His backstory as a former world noble who was cast out of paradise and grew up consumed by hatred and a desire for power is compelling and tragic. The theme of an entire country being manipulated by a tyrant who controls information and erases people from existence is powerful and relevant. The relationship between Kiros and Rebecca is emotionally resonant. The moment when Sugar's powers are broken and every toy in the country reverts back to a human being, and thousands of people suddenly remember family members and friends they had completely forgotten, is one of the most powerful scenes in all of One Piece. All of that is in the anime. It is all there, but it is buried under so much padding that the impact is severely diluted. Moments that should hit like a truck in the anime instead arrive with a soft thud because you have been sitting through hours and hours of nothing to get to them. The emotional payoffs feel less satisfying because the buildup was not tight and purposeful. It was bloated and repetitive. Dressrosa in the anime is like being told a great joke, but the person telling it takes 40 minutes to get to the punchline and keeps repeating the setup over and over again. By the time you finally hear the punchline, you are too tired to laugh. Dressrosa is the arc that people point to when they want to explain why the One Piece anime is unwatchable. It is the single best piece of evidence that something is fundamentally broken about how the show is produced. And while the arcs that came after Dressrosa did improve in some ways, particularly the Wano arc, which featured significantly better animation, the core pacing problems that made Dressrosa so painful never truly went away. They just became slightly less extreme. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But Dressrosa's pacing issues, as terrible as they are, only tell part of the story, because the padding in One Piece is not just about stretching scenes longer or adding more episodes than necessary. There is a specific set of techniques the anime uses to eat up time within every single episode, and two of them in particular have become so overused, so constant, and so deeply embedded in the show's DNA that they have fundamentally changed what it feels like to watch One Piece on a scene-by-scene level. Section 8. The Flashback and Reaction Shot Epidemic. If you have ever watched a One Piece episode and felt like barely anything happened, even though you just sat through 22 minutes of content, this section is going to explain exactly why that feel exists. Because beyond the recaps at the start of episodes and beyond the overall slow pacing that stretches arcs far longer than they need to be, there are two specific tricks the anime uses constantly to eat up time within the episodes themselves. And once you notice them, you cannot stop noticing them. They are flashbacks and reaction shots, and the One Piece anime is absolutely addicted to both. Let us start with the reaction shots, because they are the more subtle of the two, and the one that sneaks up on you. A reaction shot is exactly what it sounds like. Something happens in the story. A punch lands, a character says something shocking, a villain reveals their plan. And instead of the show continuing forward with the next beat of the story, the camera cuts to other characters reacting to what just happened. Their eyes go wide, their jaws drop, they gasp, they stare. And then the camera holds on their face for 3, 4, 5 seconds while dramatic music plays. Then it cuts to another character doing the exact same thing. Wide eyes, open mouth, gasp, stare. Then another character. Same thing. Then maybe it cuts back to the original moment. And then we get another round of reactions from a different group of people watching from somewhere else. In the manga, a reaction might be a single small panel in the corner of the page. It takes up maybe 1/20th of the page space. Your eyes pass over it in less than a second, and then move on to the next part of the story. It serves its purpose. You understand that people are shocked. You move on. In the anime, that same reaction gets turned into a 30-second to 1-minute sequence of multiple characters gasping one after another. And this does not happen once per episode.
It happens multiple times per episode, in almost every single episode,
across the entire run of the series. The overuse of reaction shots is one of the main reasons individual episodes of One Piece feel so slow. They break the flow of action constantly. When a fight is happening and every punch is followed by a cut to 5 different bystanders looking surprised, the fight loses all of its speed and momentum. What should feel like a fast, intense exchange of blows instead feels like a slideshow of shocked faces with occasional punches in between. The viewer wants to see what happens next in the fight. They want to feel the energy and the danger. But the anime keeps pulling them out of the action to show them people standing on the sidelines making the same surprised face over and over again. This problem gets worse during the big climactic moments of each arc. These are supposed to be the scenes where everything comes together, where the tension peaks and the action reaches its highest point. But because these moments are considered important, the anime piles on even more reaction shots than usual. A single decisive punch from Luffy might be preceded by 2 minutes of buildup, where the camera slowly zooms in on his fist, then cuts to his crewmates watching nervously, then cuts to the villain looking confident, then cuts to random citizens of whatever island they are on looking scared, then cuts back to Luffy, and then finally the punch lands. And after it lands, you get another full round of reaction shots from everyone who just watched it happen. A moment that takes 1 page in the manga and hits with immediate, powerful impact gets stretched into a multi-minute sequence that drains all the energy out of it. The Whole Cake Island arc is one of the worst offenders when it comes to this. During this arc, there are extended sequences of the Straw Hats running through Big Mom's territory, being chased by her forces. In the manga, these chase sequences are fast-paced and frantic. The characters are moving quickly, dodging attacks, making split-second decisions, and the panels fly by with a sense of urgency. In the anime, entire episodes were dedicated to the crew literally just running down corridors and through forests. The running would be interrupted constantly by reaction shots of characters looking over their shoulders, gasping at something behind them, or staring ahead with determined faces. For fans watching the anime weekly during Whole Cake Island, there were stretches where it felt like nothing happened for weeks, except characters running and reacting to the fact that they were running. Now let us talk about the flashbacks. Because if reaction shots are a slow drain on each episode's momentum, flashbacks are the sledgehammer that completely stops the story dead in its tracks. One Piece is a show that loves flashbacks, and in many cases, that love is completely justified. Some of the greatest moments in the entire series are flashbacks. Robin's childhood in Ohara, where she watched her home island be destroyed by the world government, is a flashback. Sanji's starvation on the rock with Zeph is a flashback. The story of Kozuki Oden and his adventures with both Whitebeard and Goldie Roger is a flashback. When One Piece does a major character flashback as part of the story, it is usually brilliant, emotional, and essential to understanding who that character is and why they do what they do. The problem is not with those big, planned flashbacks. The problem is with the constant, repetitive, small flashbacks that the anime inserts into episodes purely to fill time. These are not planned story moments. These are scenes that the anime production team drops into episodes to remind the viewer of things that happened recently, and they show up with exhausting frequency. Here is how it typically works. A character will appear on screen or be mentioned by name, and the anime will immediately cut to a flashback showing something that character did a few episodes ago. Maybe it is a scene from 3 episodes back. Maybe it is a scene from earlier in the same arc. Maybe it is a scene that was already shown as a flashback in a previous episode and is now being shown again. The flashback runs for 1 to 3 minutes, then the anime returns to the present and the story continues from where it left off. This happens multiple times per episode in many arcs. The Egghead Island arc, which is the most recent major arc at the time of this discussion, has drawn particular criticism for this. During the stretch of episodes that focused on the backstory of Bartholomew Kuma and his daughter Jewelry Bonnie, the anime replayed the same flashback scenes across multiple consecutive episodes. Viewers watching week to week were seeing the same emotional scenes recycled over and over with barely any new context or development added each time. What should have been a deeply moving and powerful storyline about a father's sacrifice for his daughter started to lose its emotional weight because the anime kept showing the same beats on repeat instead of moving the story forward. The Reverie arc, which covers a gathering of world leaders at the Holy Land of Mary-Jua, is another painful example. This arc reintroduces characters from many different kingdoms that the Straw Hats visited throughout their journey.
Kings and princesses from Alabasta, Dressrosa, Fishman Island, and other countries all appear at the reverie. And every single time one of these characters shows up on screen, the anime cuts to an extended flashback reminding you who they are and what happened when the Straw Hats visited their country. Even for characters that fans remember perfectly well, like Vivi from Alabasta or Shirahoshi from Fishman Island, the anime still plays flashbacks that can run for 2 or 3 minutes each. An arc that should be exciting and fast-paced, filled with political tension and major world-changing events, instead gets bogged down in a constant cycle of flashbacks to things that happened hundreds of episodes ago. The worst part about these repetitive flashbacks is that they are not even necessary for the target audience. The people watching One Piece weekly on television in Japan are dedicated fans who have been following the show for years. They know who Vivi is, they know what happened in Alabasta. They do not need a 3-minute refresher every time she appears on screen. And for binge watchers who are catching up on the series, these flashbacks are even more pointless because they watched the original scenes much more recently than weekly viewers did. Nobody benefits from seeing the same flashback for the 4th time in 2 weeks. And yet the anime keeps doing it because those flashbacks fill minutes that would otherwise need to be filled with new content that requires more effort to produce. The combination of reaction shots and repetitive flashbacks creates a viewing experience where each episode feels like it is fighting against itself. You get a minute or 2 of new story content, then a reaction shot sequence, then a flashback, then another minute of new content, then another set of reactions, then another flashback. The actual plot inches forward at an agonizingly slow rate, and the viewer spends most of their time watching content they have already seen, or watching characters make faces instead of doing things. It is a frustrating cycle that repeats itself in nearly every episode of the post-timeskip anime. When fans compare the One Piece anime to the manga, this is one of the biggest differences they point to. In the manga, Oda's pacing is tight. Panels are packed with information. A single page of the manga might contain a key plot development, a joke, a reaction, and a transition to the next scene. There is no room for padding because every inch of page space is being used for something. In the anime, that same page of content might get stretched across half an episode because every element gets expanded, every reaction gets its own extended shot, and every reference to a past event gets a full flashback treatment. One of the most telling examples is the Marineford War arc. In the manga, Marineford is a hurricane of action and emotion. Major events happen on nearly every page. Characters clash, alliances shift, and the stakes are constantly escalating. It is fast, it is intense, and it is one of the most celebrated stretches of storytelling in the entire series. In the anime, Marineford still has powerful moments, but the padding is everywhere. Battles that should crackle with energy get interrupted by long reaction shot sequences. Major reveals are followed by extended flashbacks to set up context the viewer already has. The sense of urgency that makes the manga version so gripping gets diluted by the constant stop and start nature of the anime's padding. This is the core tragedy of the One Piece anime. Oda writes a story that is meant to be experienced at a certain pace, with a certain rhythm and flow. The manga has that rhythm. The anime takes that same story and disrupts the rhythm at every possible opportunity, stuffing it with reaction shots that break the momentum and flashbacks that stop the story cold. The content is the same, but the delivery is fundamentally different. And that difference is what turns a masterpiece into something that many people find genuinely difficult to sit through. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But the padding techniques we have talked about so far, the recaps, the stretch scenes, the reaction shots, and the flashbacks, are all problems with how the story is presented. There is another major criticism of the One Piece anime that has nothing to do with pacing or padding at all, and it is something that has frustrated fans for the entire 25-year run of the show. It is the wildly inconsistent quality of the animation itself, and how the studio responsible for bringing Oda's art to life has struggled to do it justice for much of the series. Section 9. Toei's animation. Inconsistency as a constant. Everything we have talked about so far has been about pacing. The stretched episodes, the repeated flashbacks, the padded scenes, all of it comes down to the anime taking too long to tell a story that moves much faster in the manga. But there is another problem with the One Piece anime that has nothing to do with how fast or slow the story moves. It is about how the show looks. Because for a series that has been running for over 25 years and is one of the most profitable anime properties on the planet, the One Piece anime
has had a shockingly inconsistent level of visual quality for most of its run. Toei Animation is the studio behind the One Piece anime, and they have been producing the show since it first aired in 1999. Toei is one of the biggest animation studios in Japan. They are the studio that made Dragon Ball, Sailor Moon, and Digimon. They have enormous resources and decades of experience, and yet, for large stretches of One Piece's run, the animation quality has been a constant source of frustration for fans. Some episodes look great. Others look like they were drawn in a rush, with half the staff missing. And the gap between the best-looking episodes and the worst-looking episodes is enormous. The early years of the anime, roughly from episode 1 through episode 278, are generally considered the most visually consistent era of the show. This period was overseen by director Konosuke Uda, and while the animation was never going to compete with big-budget movie productions, it had a charm and a consistency that matched the tone of the story. Characters looked like themselves from episode to episode. The action scenes had decent energy. The art style worked well with Oda's goofy character designs and the colorful world he created. It was not perfect, but it was solid, and fans were happy with it. Things started to change around the Thriller Bark arc, which is where many fans noticed the first real dip in consistency. Thriller Bark has some genuinely beautiful moments of animation, particularly during the bigger fights, but it also has stretches where the art quality drops noticeably. Character faces look slightly off. Body proportions shift from scene to scene. And this is also the era where the recaps at the start of episodes started getting longer, sometimes running for 8 minutes or more, which meant the production team had even less time and resources to devote to the new content in each episode. After the time skip, which happens around episode 517, the problems got worse. The stretch of the anime covering Fishman Island through Punk Hazard, roughly from 2011 to 2014, is often considered one of the most visually unappealing periods of the entire series. The animation frequently felt flat and lifeless. Characters would stand in static poses during conversations. Action scenes lacked the energy and movement that fights in One Piece should have. The Luffy vs. Hody Jones fight on Fishman Island, which should have been an exciting showcase of Luffy's new post-time skip abilities, was criticized for its limited movement, stiff body poses, and sluggish pacing. What felt intense and powerful in the manga became slow and underwhelming on screen. During the Dressrosa arc, the animation problems continued alongside the pacing issues we already discussed. Character models were frequently inconsistent. Faces would look slightly wrong, with eyes placed too far apart or jawlines that changed shape between scenes. The character Rebecca in particular became a symbol of the arc's visual inconsistency, with her appearance shifting noticeably depending on which animator was handling a given scene. When you combine poor pacing with inconsistent art, you get an arc that is difficult to watch for multiple reasons at once. Part of the reason for these inconsistencies comes down to how Toei produces the show. One Piece is a weekly anime, which means a new episode has to be ready for broadcast every single week. That is an incredibly demanding schedule. Each episode requires hundreds of individual drawings, and the production team has to work under tight deadlines with limited budgets. Toei has been known for keeping production costs low across their shows, and One Piece is no exception. The studio also relies on outsourcing work to animation teams in other countries, and this has created its own set of problems. Foreign animators who are brought in to help with the workload are not always familiar with the specific style and techniques used in Japanese animation. The way characters move, the way action flows from frame to frame, the small details that make Japanese animation look and feel the way it does. These are things that take time to learn. When foreign animators are not yet comfortable with these techniques, their work can look noticeably different from the rest of the episode, and the animation directors have to step in and correct mistakes. But corrections take time, and deadlines do not wait. So sometimes scenes go out with visible inconsistencies because there simply was not enough time to fix everything before the episode needed to air. The Whole Cake Island arc, which introduced a new chief animation director named Keiichi Ichikawa, had a rough start visually. The early episodes of the arc featured noticeable character model problems, with faces looking slightly off and body proportions shifting awkwardly during action scenes. Things did improve as the arc went on, particularly during the Luffy vs. Katakuri fight, which featured some genuinely impressive animation. But the road to get there was bumpy, and the inconsistency was hard to ignore. The Wano Country arc, which began in 2019, represented a major turning point for the anime's visual quality. Wano featured a dramatic shift in art style,
with bolder colors, more dynamic camera work, and a visual approach that was clearly influenced by traditional Japanese art and woodblock prints. The animation quality during Wano's biggest moments was genuinely outstanding. Director Megumi Ishitani in particular became a fan favorite for her work on several episodes that were praised as some of the best-looking episodes in the entire series. Episode 1015, which adapted one of the most iconic moments in One Piece, was called a visual masterpiece by fans, and even drew praise from other anime directors. But even within Wano, the inconsistency remained. Not every episode looked like the ones Ishitani directed. Many episodes in the first half of the arc still had the same old problems: inconsistent character models, stiff animation during quieter scenes, and visual quality that varied wildly from one episode to the next. Some fans also felt that the new art style, while impressive during action scenes, looked too glossy and too different from the classic One Piece look during regular dialogue scenes. The transition from the old style to the new one was jarring for some viewers, and the inconsistency between high-effort episodes and low-effort episodes made the gap feel even wider. The contrast between the One Piece anime and other modern anime is where this criticism really stings. Shows like Demon Slayer, animated by Ufotable, maintain a consistently high level of animation quality across every single episode. Jujutsu Kaisen, animated by MAPPA, delivers fluid and dynamic action in nearly every fight. These shows benefit from the seasonal format, which gives their production teams months of preparation time between seasons to ensure every episode meets a high standard. One Piece, chained to its weekly schedule, simply cannot compete with that level of consistent quality. The production team does not have the luxury of time. They are on a treadmill that never stops, and the visual quality of the show reflects that reality. Fans have long argued that One Piece deserves better. It is one of the most successful manga ever created, with over 500 million copies sold worldwide. It generates enormous revenue through merchandise, video games, movies, and streaming. And yet the weekly anime, the version of the story that most people experience first, has spent large portions of its run looking significantly worse than it should for a property of this size and importance. The announcement of The One Piece, the upcoming remake being produced by Wit Studio, has given fans hope that the story will finally get the consistent visual treatment it deserves. But that project is still in the future, and the original anime, with all of its visual ups and downs, is still the version that over 1,000 episodes of viewers have experienced. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The animation inconsistency is frustrating on its own, but it becomes even harder to overlook when you combine it with a storytelling habit that has plagued One Piece since its earliest arcs and continues to undermine the emotional weight of the series to this day. It is a habit that even the most devoted fans struggle to defend, and it has to do with what happens when characters in One Piece are supposed to die. Section 10. Fake Deaths. Oda's Worst Habit. Destroying the stakes. Every great story needs stakes. The audience needs to feel like the characters are in real danger, that the situations they face have real consequences, and that not everyone is going to make it out okay. When a story has real stakes, the big moments hit harder. The victories feel earned. The losses feel painful, and the viewer stays on the edge of their seat because they genuinely do not know what is going to happen next. One Piece, for all of its incredible strengths, has one habit that completely undermines the feeling of danger in the story, and it is something that even the most dedicated fans agree is the series' biggest flaw. One Piece has a fake death problem. A fake death is when the story makes it look like a character has died. The show gives you all the emotional cues. There is dramatic music, other characters cry and mourn. The scene is framed as a sacrifice or a tragic loss. You, the viewer, feel sad because you believe this character is gone. And then, sometime later, usually at the end of the arc, or sometimes even hundreds of episodes later, the character shows up, alive and well, with little to no explanation for how they survived. The emotional weight of their death is completely erased, and the time you spent feeling sad about them was wasted. One Piece does this constantly, and it has been doing it since the very early arcs of the series. The first notable fake death happens during the Syrup Village arc with a character named Mary, who is the butler to a young girl named Kaya. The villain Captain Kuro slashes Mary across the chest with his bladed gloves in a scene that is presented as a killing blow. Mary looks dead, The scene is dramatic and brutal, but later it turns out Mary survived and only suffered minor injuries. The Netflix live-action adaptation actually chose to kill Mary for real, and the decision was widely praised for adding real weight to that moment, which says a lot about how the original version handled it. But the single most famous and most criticized fake death in all of One Piece is Pell during the Alabasta arc. Pell is one of the head guards of the Alabasta Kingdom, and he has a devil fruit that allows him to transform into a falcon. During the climax of the arc, a massive bomb is discovered in the capital city of Alubarna. The bomb has a blast radius of 5 kilometers, which means it would destroy the entire city and kill everyone in it. With no time left, Pell grabs the bomb, transforms into his falcon form, and flies straight up into the sky as fast as he can. The bomb explodes while Pell is carrying it, high above the city. The explosion is enormous. Pell saved the city and everyone in it, but the clear implication is that he sacrificed his life to do it. It is presented as an unambiguous death. Other characters mourn him. The scene is emotional. The audience is meant to feel the weight of his sacrifice. And then, at the very end of the Alabasta arc, Pell is shown alive. He is sitting in a bed, bandaged up but clearly fine. No explanation is given for how he survived an explosion that was powerful enough to level an entire city. He just did. Over 20 years later, Pell's survival is still one of the most criticized moments in the entire series. And it is the fake death that fans point to when they talk about this problem. It set a pattern that would repeat itself over and over throughout the rest of One Piece. During the Skypiea arc, a character named Pagaya, who is the father of a girl named Conus, gets hit directly by a massive bolt of lightning from the villain Enel. Enel's lightning is shown throughout the arc to be devastatingly powerful. He uses it to destroy buildings and knock out some of the strongest fighters on the island. When Pagaya takes a direct hit, the scene is presented as if he has been killed. But later, he shows up alive, with no real explanation for how he survived a direct strike from one of the most powerful attacks in the arc. During the Whole Cake Island arc, a character named Pound makes what appears to be a heroic last stand. Pound is the father of 2 of Big Mom's daughters, Chiffon and Lola, and he has spent the entire arc trying to reconnect with his children after being cast out by Big Mom years ago. In his final scene, he is shown being struck down by the villain Oven while trying to protect his daughter's escape. The scene is framed as a tragic death. He never got to tell his daughters who he really was. It is heartbreaking. And then, in a cover story that ran in the manga much later, Pound is revealed to be alive. He survived and eventually reunited with his family. The emotional impact of his sacrifice was completely undone. The Wano Country arc took the fake death problem to an entirely new level. Multiple characters who appeared to die during the massive war on Onigashima were later revealed to be alive. Kinemon, one of the samurai leading the rebellion against the villain Kaido, was stabbed straight through his body by Kaido himself after being hit with an incredibly powerful attack. The scene was brutal and appeared to be fatal, but Kinemon survived because, in a moment that many fans found hard to accept, his body had been improperly reassembled by Trafalgar Law's powers from an earlier arc, which somehow allowed him to split apart at the point of the stab rather than being killed by it. Kiku, another samurai, had her arm cut off and appeared to bleed out during the battle. She survived. Kanjuro, who was revealed to be a traitor working against the Samurai Alliance, appeared to die not once but twice during the Wano arc, before he was finally confirmed dead. Ashura Doji and Izo are among the few characters who actually did die during Wano, but their deaths felt less impactful because by that point, fans had been conditioned to assume that nobody in One Piece actually dies, unless they see absolute, undeniable proof. Even outside of Wano, the fake deaths continued. Jaguar D, Saul, a marine giant who befriended a young Nico Robin on the island of Ohara, was shown being frozen solid by Admiral Aokiji during the devastating attack that destroyed Ohara and everyone on it. For hundreds of chapters and episodes, fans believed Saul was dead. His apparent death was a key part of Robin's tragic backstory, and one of the reasons she spent her life running from the world government. Then, during the Egghead Island arc, it was revealed that Saul survived. He is alive and well. Another death that was used to create emotional weight, only to have that weight removed later. The pattern is so consistent that it has fundamentally changed how fans experience the story. When a character in One Piece appears to die, the immediate reaction from most fans is not sadness. It is skepticism. They do not believe it. They have been burned too many times. They know that unless a character's death is shown in a flashback, which is where most of the real, permanent deaths in One Piece happen, there is a very high chance the character will show up alive later. Characters like Whitebeard and Ace, who died during the Marineford arc, and characters like Corazon, who died in Law's backstory flashback, are among the few whose deaths are treated as real and permanent. But those deaths stand out precisely because they are so rare. In a series with over 1,000 chapters and over 1,000 episodes, the number of characters who have actually permanently died outside of flashbacks can be counted on your fingers. This matters because it drains the tension out of every arc. When the Straw Hats are in a life or death battle, the audience should feel afraid for them and for the people around them. They should worry about who might not make it. But when the show has spent 25 years demonstrating that almost nobody dies, no matter how impossible their survival seems, that fear disappears. There are no real stakes. Nobody is in real danger. And the big dramatic moments where a character appears to sacrifice themselves lose all of their power because the audience is already waiting for the inevitable reveal that they survived. The fake death problem is something that affects the anime and the manga equally, since these moments come directly from Oda's writing. But in the anime, where scenes are drawn out longer and emotional moments are given even more dramatic weight through music and extended shots, the fake deaths feel even worse. The anime spends more time making you feel sad about a character's death than the manga does, which means the betrayal of finding out they are alive hits even harder. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But fake deaths are not the only way One Piece undermines the experience of watching its female characters, because there is another long-running criticism of the series that has grown louder and louder over the years, and it has to do with how the women of One Piece are drawn, designed, and treated by both the manga and especially the anime. Section 11. The same body, different name. One Piece's female character problem. One Piece has some of the most creative and diverse character designs in all of anime. The men in this series come in every shape and size imaginable. Luffy is a skinny rubber boy with a round face. Zoro is a muscular swordsman built like a tank. Usopp is tall and lanky with a long nose. Chopper is a tiny reindeer who can transform into different forms. Frankie is a massive cyborg with a body that looks like it was built in a car factory. Brook is a literal skeleton. Whitebeard was a giant of a man who towered over everyone around him. Blackbeard is round and messy and looks nothing like a typical anime villain. Katakuri is impossibly tall with a scarred mouth he hides behind a scarf. Kaido is built like a mountain. The male characters in One Piece cover the entire spectrum of body types, face shapes, heights, and proportions, and that variety is one of the things that makes the world feel so alive and interesting. Now look at the women. Nami, Robin, Boa Hancock, Vivi, Shirahoshi, Rebecca, Viola, Yamato, Bonnie. Take away their hair color and their outfits, and a huge number of them share the exact same body. Extremely thin waist, very large chest, long legs, hourglass figure, same basic face shape with large eyes and a small nose. There are exceptions on the other end of the spectrum, characters like Big Mom or Alvida before she ate her devil fruit, who are drawn as large or unconventional looking, but those characters are almost always villains or comic relief. The women who are meant to be seen as heroic, kind, beautiful, or important to the story almost all share the same physical template, and that template has only become more exaggerated as the series has gone on. This was not always the case. In the early parts of the series, the female characters had more variety and more realistic proportions. Nami during the East Blue Saga was drawn as a relatively normal-looking young woman. She was slim, but not unrealistically so. Her body proportions were on the stylized side, as is typical for manga and anime, but they were within a range that you could look at and not immediately think something was off. Robin, when she first appeared during the Alabasta arc, had a similar design. She was tall, slender, and attractive, but her proportions were reasonable by anime standards. The shift happened gradually, but it became very noticeable around the time of the Enies Lobby arc, which is roughly where Oda's art style started leaning more heavily into exaggerated proportions for female characters. By the time the 2-year time skip happened and the Straw Hats reunited on Sabaody Archipelago, The change was impossible to ignore. Nami's chest had grown significantly. Her waist had shrunk to an almost impossibly thin line. Robin went through a similar transformation. Both characters looked noticeably different from how they had been drawn for the first 500 chapters and episodes of the series, and the changes were not exactly subtle. Fans noticed immediately, and the reaction was mixed. Some fans did not mind the change and saw it as simply part of Oda's evolving art style. Others were disappointed and felt that the redesigns were purely about making the characters more sexually appealing, rather than serving any story purpose. The criticism was not that attractive characters should not exist in One Piece. The criticism was that almost every important female character was being drawn with the exact same body type, and that the variety and creativity that made the male character designs so fun and interesting was almost completely absent when it came to the women. Oda himself has addressed this criticism in the past. In one of his SBS question and answer segments that he runs in the manga volumes, a fan directly called him out for the way he draws female characters. Oda's response was to essentially say that he draws what he wants to draw because One Piece is a manga aimed at young boys. And he framed the criticism as something his audience should just accept. He told readers to stay strong and keep living life, which many people interpreted as him dismissing the feedback entirely, rather than engaging with it seriously. For fans who wanted to see more variety in how women were drawn in One Piece, it was a discouraging response. The problem goes beyond just the body proportions. It also shows up in how the female characters are dressed and presented, particularly in the anime. Toei Animation has been repeatedly criticized for taking Oda's already exaggerated designs and pushing them even further. In multiple arcs, Toei has drawn female characters with even larger proportions and more revealing outfits than what Oda drew in the manga. The anime will add camera angles that emphasize certain body parts, extend scenes that show characters in states of undress, and create shots that were never in the manga for the apparent purpose of showing off the female characters' bodies. During the Wano arc, this became a particular point of criticism. Nearly every female character shown during the Onigashima raid was drawn in clothing that seemed designed to show off their physical features, rather than serve any practical or story-related purpose. This included not just the villains, but also the heroic characters. Nami and Robin, who were in the middle of a massive battle with their lives on the line, were consistently drawn in outfits and poses that prioritized how they looked over what they were doing. The anime took what was already present in the manga and amplified it significantly. The Egghead Island arc brought another wave of criticism when the anime's handling of the character Bonnie drew negative attention from fans. Bonnie has a devil fruit that allows her to change her age, and she spends time in both her child form and her adult form during the arc. In the anime, there were scenes where Bonnie's body was shown in ways that fans felt were unnecessarily sexualized, particularly in scenes involving bathing, and these portrayals went beyond what was in the manga. The criticism was especially pointed because Bonnie's actual age has been a topic of discussion among fans, making the sexualized portrayal feel even more uncomfortable. The skin color of certain characters has also been a source of controversy in the anime. During Egghead, the anime lightened the skin color of S. Snake, one of the Seraphim characters, making her noticeably lighter than the other Seraphim for no apparent narrative reason. Fans were quick to notice the change and questioned why it was made, since it had no basis in the manga. Now, it is important to acknowledge that One Piece does have strong female characters in terms of their roles in the story. Nami is the navigator of the Straw Hat crew, and without her skills, the crew would never be able to sail the Grand Line. She is smart, resourceful, and brave, and her backstory during the Arlong Park arc is one of the most emotionally powerful moments in the entire series. Robin is the only person alive who can read the poneglyphs, the ancient stones that hold the key to finding the One Piece treasure. Without Robin, Luffy's dream of becoming king of the pirates is literally impossible. Both women are essential to the crew in ways that go far beyond just being there to look at. Their backstories are among the best in the series. Nami's childhood under Arlong's control and her desperate fight to free her village is heartbreaking. Robin's story as a child watching her home island of Ohara be destroyed by the world government, losing everyone she loved, and spending 20 years running from the world as a wanted criminal is one of the most tragic and beautifully told stories in all of One Piece. Her moment during the Enies Lobby arc, where she finally admits that she wants to live, and the Straw Hats declare war on the entire world government to save her, is considered by many fans to be the single greatest scene in the entire series. But here is the frustration. After those arcs are over, after Nami is freed from Arlong, and after Robin is rescued from the world government, Their roles in the story gradually shift. They go from being at the center of the narrative to supporting players who rarely get the spotlight. They still contribute to the crew, and they still have moments of brilliance, but they are not given the same focus and development that the male crew members continue to receive. Their fighting abilities, while present, are rarely showcased in the same way Luffy's or Zoro's or Sanji's are, and their visual presentation increasingly leans toward their physical appearance rather than their abilities or intelligence. This pattern extends beyond just Nami and Robin. One Piece has introduced several princess characters throughout the series, including Vivi from Alabasta, Shirahoshi from Fishman Island, and Rebecca from Dressrosa. Each of these characters has moments of real depth and emotional resonance. Vivi's love for her country and her willingness to sacrifice everything to save it is genuinely moving. Shirahoshi's connection to the ancient weapon Poseidon gives her one of the most important roles in the entire world of One Piece. But all three of them are also drawn with the same exaggerated body template, and all three of them spend significant portions of their arcs crying, needing to be rescued, or standing on the sidelines while the male characters fight the major battles. The contrast between how male and female characters are treated in One Piece is hard to ignore when you look at it across the full length of the series. Male characters get a wide range of body types, fighting styles, and character arcs that continue to develop over time. Female characters tend to get one major arc of focus, a single body type if they are meant to be seen as attractive, and a gradual reduction in screen importance after their introduction arc is over. There are exceptions, and the series has made efforts in more recent arcs to give women more agency, but the overall pattern has been consistent enough that it remains one of the most common criticisms fans have about the series. This criticism applies to both the manga and the anime, but the anime makes it worse by amplifying the physical exaggeration and adding fan service moments that Oda never drew. The combination of same body type designs, diminishing narrative roles after introduction arcs, and anime-added sexualization creates a version of the show where the women of One Piece are often treated as decorations rather than fully realized characters, and for a series that is capable of writing such powerful and complex female stories, that is a genuine waste. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But even if One Piece handled its female characters perfectly, there would still be one more major problem with the anime that makes the show genuinely difficult to sit through, and it has to do with the moments. That should be the most exciting part of any anime, the fights, and how the One Piece anime manages to turn even the most anticipated battles into something that feels like a test of endurance rather than a thrill. Section 12. The fight that never ends. When battles become a chore. Fights are supposed to be the best part of any action anime. They are the moments you wait for, the moments the entire arc has been building toward. The hero has struggled, trained, suffered, and now it is finally time to face the villain and put everything on the line. In the best anime, fights are electric. They are fast, intense, and packed with emotion. Every punch matters. Every hit feels like it could change everything. You sit on the edge of your seat, heart pounding, eyes glued to the screen, because you have no idea what is going to happen next. That is what a great fight feels like. One Piece has the ingredients for some of the greatest fights in anime history. The power system is creative and unpredictable. Devil Fruits give characters abilities that range from turning their body into rubber, to controlling gravity, to transforming into a phoenix. Haki, the spiritual energy system that gets introduced later in the series, adds another layer of depth to combat. The villains are compelling and powerful, and the stakes behind each fight are deeply personal. Luffy does not fight people because he wants to be the strongest. He fights because someone he cares about is being hurt, or because an injustice is being committed that he cannot ignore. The emotional foundation for incredible fights is always there, and in the manga, the fights deliver on that foundation. Oda knows how to pace a battle. His panels are dynamic and full of movement. Punches connect with impact. The action flows from one page to the next with a rhythm that keeps you turning pages as fast as you can. A major fight in the manga might take 20 or 30 pages, and you can read through it in a few minutes, feeling every beat of the action as it builds to a climax. The fights in the manga are exciting, satisfying, and perfectly paced. The anime takes those same fights and stretches them until the excitement bleeds out of them. What should be a tight, intense 10-minute battle gets spread across 2, 3, sometimes 4 or more full episodes. And the reason is the same problem we have been talking about throughout this entire essay. The anime does not have enough manga content to fill a full episode, so the fights get padded with the same techniques that slow down every other part of the show. Reaction shots between every punch. Flashbacks in the middle of the action. Extended stare downs, where two characters just look at each other for 30 seconds while dramatic music plays. Characters powering up in slow motion, and long stretches of side characters standing around commenting on the fight instead of the anime just showing you the fight. The Luffy vs. Hody Jones fight on Fishman Island is one of the most cited examples of this problem. On paper, this fight should have been incredible. It was the first major battle after the 2-year time skip, the first time viewers got to see how much stronger Luffy had become during his training. He had learned haki, he had new techniques. He was fighting underwater, which should have added an interesting layer of challenge, since Devil Fruit users are weakened by water. And Hody Jones, while not the most complex villain, represented a dark ideology of hatred and racism that gave the fight real thematic weight. In the manga, the fight moves quickly. Luffy dominates Hody Jones, showcasing his new abilities with confidence and power. It feels like a statement. Luffy is not the same kid who struggled against every opponent in the first half of the series. He has leveled up, and the fight makes that clear in a satisfying way. In the anime, the same fight is dragged out, with limited animation frames, characters floating in static poses with bubbles layered on top to simulate being underwater, and long pauses between attacks that destroy any sense of momentum. What should have felt fast and powerful instead felt sluggish. Fans compared it to watching a fight happen in slow motion, and it became one of the most criticized battles of the entire post-time skip era. The Luffy vs. Doflamingo fight in Dressrosa suffered from the same treatment, but on an even larger scale. This fight is the climax of one of the longest arcs in the series, and everything has been building to this moment. Doflamingo is one of the most dangerous and well-written villains in all of One Piece. The entire kingdom of Dressrosa is at stake because Doflamingo's birdcage, a massive cage made of razor-sharp strings, is slowly shrinking and will kill everyone inside if it is not stopped. There is a ticking clock. There is a villain worth hating. There is a hero worth cheering for. Every ingredient for an all-time great anime battle is right there, and the anime stretches it out until it loses its impact. The fight is spread across multiple episodes with extensive padding between the actual moments of combat. Scenes of random citizens pushing against the birdcage strings are repeated over and over again across different episodes, showing the same basic action from slightly different angles each time. Luffy's Gear 4th form, which should be an explosive and thrilling power-up, gets its big moments diluted by long stretches of the episode where very little happens. The urgency that the birdcage should create is completely undermined by the fact that the anime shows it shrinking so slowly and interrupts the tension so frequently that it stops feeling like a real threat. For fans who are watching Dressrosa week to week as it aired, the fight against Doflamingo was an exercise in patience. Each week, they tuned in hoping for meaningful progress, and each week, they got an episode where maybe 2 or 3 minutes of actual fighting happened, surrounded by reaction shots, flashbacks, and scenes of people running around or pushing against strings. What should have been the most exciting part of the arc became something fans endured rather than enjoyed. The Whole Cake Island arc brought another major fight that suffered from the same problems. The battle between Luffy and Charlotte Katakuri is widely considered one of the best fights in the manga. Katakuri is an incredible opponent. He has a stronger version of Luffy's own observation haki, allowing him to see slightly into the future. His Devil Fruit lets him create and control Mochi, which he uses in creative and devastating ways. The fight between them is long even in the manga, but it never feels padded because every chapter introduces a new wrinkle, a new challenge, or a new emotional beat. You watch Luffy grow stronger in real time as he pushes himself beyond his limits. In the anime, the Luffy vs. Katakuri fight has moments of genuinely excellent animation. Some individual episodes during this fight are among the best looking episodes the One Piece anime has ever produced. But between those highlight episodes, there are stretches where the fight slows to a crawl. Episodes where Luffy and Katakuri trade a few blows, and then the rest of the runtime is filled with scenes of other characters running through Big Mom's territory, reacting to what is happening, or replaying flashbacks of events from earlier in the arc. The inconsistency in pacing from one episode to the next makes the fight feel uneven, and the overall experience is significantly worse than reading the same fight in the manga. The Wano Country arc and its massive war on Onigashima brought the fight pacing problem to its largest scale yet. Wano features dozens of fights happening simultaneously. Luffy versus Kaido, Zoro versus King, Sanji versus Queen, Law and Kid versus Big Mom, the Scabbards versus Kaido, and many more smaller battles happening throughout the raid. In the manga, Oda cuts between these fights with precision, giving each one just enough time to progress before switching to another. It creates a sense of scale and urgency, like you are watching a massive war unfold from multiple angles at once. In the anime, this structure breaks down because each individual fight gets stretched and padded independently. An episode might focus on one fight, make almost no progress in it, and then the next episode switches to a different fight and makes almost no progress in that one either. The result is that the entire war, which should feel fast and chaotic and overwhelming, instead feels like it is happening in slow motion. Weeks go by in the real world, with episodes airing where individual battles barely move forward. The Luffy versus Kaido fight, which is the centerpiece of the entire Wano arc, and arguably the most important battle in the series up to that point, was spread across so many episodes that the cumulative effect was exhausting rather than exhilarating. This is the core problem with fights in the One Piece anime. The source material gives the anime everything it needs: great characters, creative powers, emotional stakes, and fights that are paced perfectly in the manga. But the weekly production schedule and the one chapter per episode policy force the anime to take those perfectly paced fights and inflate them with padding until the excitement is gone. Fast fights become slow, urgent fights become tedious. Climactic moments that should hit with the force of a King Kong gun instead land with a dull thud because you have been wading through episodes of filler-like content to get to them. And the really painful part is that the anime proves it can do better. When Toei puts their best animators and directors on a key episode, the result can be breathtaking. Episode 1015 of the Wano arc, directed by Megumi Ishitani, is widely regarded as one of the greatest episodes of anime ever produced. It is beautifully animated, perfectly paced, and emotionally devastating. It proves that the One Piece anime is capable of greatness when the resources and talent are focused on a single episode. But those episodes are the exception. They are the peaks surrounded by valleys of slow, padded, inconsistently animated episodes that make up the majority of the viewing experience. The fights in One Piece should be the reason people watch the show. They should be the highlight reels, the scenes fans replay over and over, the moments that make you grab someone by the shoulders and tell them they need to watch this show right now. And in the manga, they are exactly that. But in the anime, for most of its run, the fights are just another part of the show where your time is not respected, where your patience is tested, and where the incredible story that Oda created is buried under layers of padding that never needed to be there. And that, when you put it all together, every section we have covered, every problem we have broken down, from the impossible episode count, to the 4 kids disaster, to the slow start, to the 1 chapter per episode policy, to the double recaps, to the filler arcs, to the Dressrosa nightmare, to the flashback and reaction shot epidemic, to the inconsistent animation, to the fake deaths, to the female character problem, to the fights that never end. That is why people say One Piece is unwatchable. Not because the story is bad, the story might be the greatest ever told in manga, but because the anime, the version of that story that most people experience, is wrapped in so many layers of problems that the brilliance underneath becomes harder and harder to see. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.